It was the last week of September in 2017 when I took time off work to finally do something I'd been putting off for years: camp alone for a few days. I was 33 back then, working as a general contractor in Des Moines. That year had been stressful. A big project fell through in spring, and I'd been dealing with long, tiring days ever since. I needed a break. No phone, no noise, no traffic, no people. Just trees, wind, and the crunch of dirt under boots. So I packed up my old Jeep Liberty, loaded in my camping gear, a cooler, some clothes, my knife, and a weather journal I always brought on trips. I drove out to western Nebraska, where I'd once hiked with my cousin years earlier. I remembered a lightly trafficked trail that forked off from the main path of Wildridge State Park. It wasn't officially marked anymore, but I remembered where to look for it. I wanted solitude, and I knew that trail led to a quiet clearing near a narrow creek. The drive took around 7 hours. I got there by early afternoon, parked near the ranger station, paid the small entrance fee, and hiked in. The weather was good mid-60s, cloudy but dry. Perfect hiking weather. I kept a slow, steady pace and took in the smell of pine and dry grass as I worked my way through the woods. I found the fork in the trail just before dusk. It was just how I remembered, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I followed it down a thin, sloping path lined with roots and patches of yellowed grass. I reached the clearing about 45 minutes later. It was just a patch of flat land surrounded by trees, maybe 25 feet from the edge of a quiet stream. I set up camp there. I pitched my tent in a spot that seemed dry and even, rolled out my sleeping bag, then gathered some deadwood for a small fire. I wasn't planning on doing much that night, just heat up a can of chili, maybe write in my journal. I lit the fire as the sky turned orange and pink behind the trees. I didn't feel nervous. I'd camped before. I had a good knife, a headlamp, bear spray, and all my gear packed neatly inside my tent. The first night passed without anything unusual. I heard the usual sounds of the forest: twigs cracking from animals moving around, owls calling somewhere far off. At one point, I heard something splash in the creek, but I figured it was just a raccoon or deer. I slept well, aside from waking up once or twice to adjust my sleeping bag. The second day, I spent time just walking through the woods around the clearing. I didn't bring my phone or GPS. I liked the idea of disconnecting fully. I marked trees lightly with chalk so I could find my way back. I followed the creek upstream for a while and came across a pile of smooth stones stacked strangely, maybe 4 feet high, about an hour away from camp. I figured it was a cairn someone else built, maybe years ago. The way the rocks were stacked looked intentional but a bit sloppy, like whoever made it stopped halfway through. I left it alone and kept going. Later that afternoon, I cut back toward my campsite, retracing my steps using the chalk marks. Around 200 feet from camp, I noticed something odd. A piece of bark had been stripped clean off one of the trees I'd marked. Not carved or scratched, ripped off. A chunk of wood about the size of a loaf of bread was missing. The wound looked fresh, pale wood underneath, edges frayed, like it had been torn off by hand. It looked too high for a small animal, maybe 5 feet off the ground. I stopped and stared at it for a while. There weren't any claw marks and no sign of tools. I thought maybe it was a buck rubbing its antlers, but it didn't look like that. It looked like someone had just peeled it off, messily. Back at camp, everything seemed in place. My cooler was closed, the tent untouched, fire pit cold. I made dinner, tried to write in my journal, but couldn't focus. My thoughts kept going back to that tree. It didn't scare me exactly, but it made me feel like I wasn't alone out here. That night, something woke me. It was a dull thump, like a boot hitting soft dirt. I stayed still for a while, eyes open in the dark, listening. I heard another thump, then silence. I stayed awake for what felt like an hour, just listening. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I drifted off. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of my camp. About 30 feet from my tent, I saw a spot where the grass and leaves looked pressed down, like someone had stood there. The impression was faint, but it looked like a footprint. Not sharp enough to see treads or toes, but the shape was there, heel, arch, toe. I stared at it for a long time. Could have been mine. But I didn't think I'd walked over there. I checked all my food, my gear, everything was untouched. I thought about leaving that day, but I also didn't want to spook myself. I told myself it was probably just another camper passing through. The place wasn't illegal to hike, just not commonly used. I stayed, but I sharpened my knife that afternoon and kept it close. That night, I didn't light a fire. I just ate cold food, zipped myself into the tent, and listened to the woods. Around midnight, I heard something again. Soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. Crunch, crunch, stop. Then nothing. My heart was pounding. I held my knife and didn't move. The steps started again, this time farther away, moving through leaves and twigs. It didn't sound like an animal. Too heavy, too careful. I lay there, breathing shallow, straining to hear more. Eventually, I fell asleep out of pure exhaustion. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed up camp fast. As I folded up the tent, I noticed something chilling. Just behind where the tent had been, there were more pressed spots in the dirt. A few prints, larger this time, maybe size 12 boots, deep enough to show someone had stood there for a while. Not pacing, just standing. I didn't eat breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack and started heading back the way I came. I followed the creek for a bit, then hit the fork in the trail. I moved fast, barely looking up. After about an hour, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something off again. One of the chalk marks I'd left had been smeared, like someone had taken a wet hand and wiped it downward. It hadn't rained. It wasn't faded, it was intentionally wiped. I stared at it for a long time, then moved on, faster this time. I didn't see anyone on the way out. No hikers, no staff, no other cars in the lot. I got in my Jeep and drove straight back to Des Moines without stopping. For a while, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It was too vague to report. I didn't see anyone. Nothing was stolen. I wasn't harmed. But the longer I thought about it, the more certain I felt that someone had been watching me out there, following me, maybe even messing with me. There were no signs of a wild animal. No growls, no tracks. Just human-shaped footprints, quiet movements, wiped chalk marks. The kind of subtle signs you'd miss unless you were really paying attention. After that trip, I stopped solo camping. I still hike, but only on marked trails. I always let someone know where I'm going and when I'll be back. I bring a satellite phone now too, just in case. I think about that trip a lot more than I probably should. The weird thing is, I'll never really know what that person wanted. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they wanted to scare me off. Maybe they were waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know, but I'm glad I left when I did. I have a feeling that if I had stayed just one more night, things might have turned out differently. Not in a dramatic movie-type way, just bad. Quietly, suddenly bad. Looking back, I think that's the scariest part. How ordinary it all seemed. Just a quiet forest, the sound of wind in the trees, and a stranger who never showed their face. Nothing dramatic. No screams. No blood. Just silence, footprints, and the heavy feeling that I wasn't alone. That was enough. And it was real. All of it. I was 31 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern Idaho. I had been working from home for almost a year, and between the computer screen, phone calls, and city noise, something inside me just burned out. I needed space and silence, away from everyone. I wasn't new to the outdoors. I'd camped quite a bit growing up in Oregon, and I'd done a few solo trips when I was younger. But this one was meant to be longer. A week, maybe more. No schedule. I just wanted to be alone in nature, walk during the day, cook over a fire, sleep under the stars. I drove out from Boise early on a Monday morning in late September of 2021. It was cool, cloudy, and the kind of crisp air that made you think of fireplaces and hot drinks. The plan was to hike along the lesser-used trails west of Priest Lake. I'd studied some topographic maps and found a spot that didn't show any developed campsites, just forest, hills, and a couple of creeks running through. It wasn't totally isolated. I marked 3 or 4 forest roads nearby. but it wasn't the kind of place you'd just stumble into either. I parked my car near a small turnout along a narrow dirt road and started hiking in. I had everything in my pack: tent, food for over a week, water filter, stove, basic first aid, bear spray, a pistol, extra clothes, 2 flashlights, and an emergency beacon. I double-checked it all before locking the car and heading off into the trees. The first few miles were pretty uneventful, mostly steady uphill through dense pine forest. No cell service, which I expected. The ground was damp, covered in pine needles and dead leaves. The trail was faint but visible, and I made a habit of stopping every 30 minutes to check my GPS and make sure I wasn't drifting off course. By the time I reached the spot I'd picked out, a small clearing near a slope that overlooked a slow-moving creek, it was getting close to sunset. I set up my tent on the highest part of the clearing, built a small fire pit out of stones, and filtered water from the creek. The area felt perfect, quiet, with only the sound of water and the occasional rustle in the brush. I cooked a simple meal, watched the sky turn from orange to dark blue, and climbed into my tent when it got too cold to sit outside. The first night was peaceful, cold, but peaceful. I kept the rain fly off so I could see the stars through the mesh. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to some kind of animal shuffling outside. From the sound of it, probably a raccoon or something sniffing around the fire pit. I didn't move or make a sound. It wandered off eventually, and I fell back asleep. The next day, I hiked further west for a few hours without my pack, just my day gear and a small GPS. I wanted to see how far the trail went and if I could find any better camp spots. I didn't see another soul. No boot prints, no wrappers, no chopped wood. That's what I liked, that feeling of being truly out there. I got back to camp by late afternoon, tired but calm. Things stayed normal for the first few days. I fell into a rhythm, waking with the light, hiking or exploring until mid-afternoon, cooking, and then reading in my tent with a headlamp until I got tired. The weather was cold but dry. On day 4, I found a cluster of old tree stumps about a mile from camp. It looked like someone had cut them maybe 10 or 15 years ago. The wood was gray and cracked. I thought it might have been a temporary logging site. Nothing recent. I walked a bit farther and found the remains of a fire pit and a few broken branches stacked like a crude lean-to. It didn't look fresh, and there was no trash or gear left behind. Just odd. That night, I stayed alert. I couldn't explain why, but something about the old camp felt off. Not in a supernatural way, more like someone had left in a hurry. I kept telling myself it was just an old hunter's spot or maybe a logger taking a break. But the lean-to looked half-built, like someone had started and then abandoned it halfway. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, listening for footsteps or movement, but it was silent. On day 5, I stayed closer to camp. I collected wood, cleaned up my gear, reorganized my food supply. Around noon, I noticed something strange. A line of shallow impressions in the dirt just past the creek. They weren't shoe prints exactly, more like indents made by something round. At first, I thought maybe an elk or deer had walked through after the rain, but the spacing was weird, equal deliberate. I followed them for a few feet before they faded into the grass. That night, I heard something again, heavier than before, not a raccoon. It was slow, steady, and it stopped every few steps. I held my breath and listened from inside the tent. I had my bear spray in one hand, my pistol in the other. The steps circled halfway around the tent, then paused. I stayed frozen. Then they moved away back toward the trees. I waited over an hour before I finally unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight around. Nothing. No eyes, no noise, no wind. I stayed up until sunrise. By morning, I was convinced it had been a bear. I found no tracks, but the ground near my fire pit looked disturbed, like something had brushed through it. I packed up most of my food and hung it further up in a tree. I didn't want to leave early, but the unease was growing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It didn't feel like a random animal anymore. I started to think someone might be out here too, someone watching. That afternoon, while gathering wood, I found something that confirmed it. A strip of fabric hanging from a branch, about 4 feet off the ground. It looked like part of a backpack strap, faded green, frayed at one end. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, wondering how old it was. I looked around for more signs, but there was nothing, just that strap, blowing slightly in the breeze. I moved my tent that evening, not far, just a few hundred feet uphill, behind a dense patch of undergrowth. I didn't start a fire. I ate cold food and turned off my headlamp early. I didn't want to be seen. I barely slept. I kept hearing what sounded like faint movement, branches snapping softly in the dark, but never close enough to be sure. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was supposed to stay longer, but I didn't want to push it. I packed everything, triple-checked the area, and started hiking back toward the road. I moved fast, barely stopping. I made it to the trailhead by late afternoon. My car was right where I left it. No sign of tampering, no flat tires, just covered in dust. As I loaded my gear into the back, I spotted something that stopped me cold. Near the edge of the turnout, half hidden in the tall grass, was a small pile of stones. Not natural, stacked carefully, 4 or 5 flat rocks in a pyramid shape. It wasn't there when I arrived. I was sure of it. I didn't touch it. I just got in the car and drove, heart pounding the entire way. Back in Boise, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know what to say. I didn't have proof, just feelings and strange signs. But I started looking into missing person reports in the area. I found one from 2019, male, mid-30s, solo hiker, disappeared somewhere near the same region. No trace ever found. I couldn't stop thinking about the half-built shelter, the strip of fabric, the footsteps at night. I haven't gone camping alone since. Now, 3 years later, I still don't know who or what was out there. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters, but I know when I'm being watched. Someone was out there in those woods, and I think they had been there for a long time. Long enough to make the place feel like theirs. I don't think they wanted me there. I think I left just in time, and I'll never go back. I left early in the morning, just after sunrise, with a full tank of gas, 2 large jugs of water, a cooler packed with food, a backpack of essentials, and my old tent that had been sitting in the garage since the fall. The plan was simple. 2 nights out in the woods near Lake Emory, a place I had never camped before but had read about on a local forum. It wasn't a marked campsite, which was exactly what I wanted. No other people, no amenities, no picnic tables or fire rings. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I drove through smaller and smaller roads until the pavement gave way to gravel and then finally to a dirt path that didn't look much like a road at all. I followed the directions I'd written out, which took me through tight turns, past creeks and wide meadows. I stopped twice to move fallen branches off the path. Eventually, I found the flat clearing described in the post. It wasn't far from the lake, but you couldn't see the water from where I parked. I liked that. It made the spot feel more hidden, like a place people didn't just stumble across. I parked the car under the shade of a big pine tree, stepped out, and just listened. I didn't hear anything except for birds. No traffic, no voices, not even the sound of a boat engine. I took a deep breath and unpacked slowly, laying out the tent components on the soft ground, making sure I had everything. The forest floor here was thick with pine needles and moss. The smell was rich and earthy. The trees were tall and tight together, and the canopy filtered the sunlight into long green beams. Setting up took a while. The ground wasn't perfectly flat, so I had to shift the tent's position twice. Once it was up, I rolled out my sleeping pad and bag, then set a small area near a fallen log as my cooking spot. I used some rocks to circle a safe fire pit, even though I didn't plan to make a fire the first night. I brought a portable burner instead, just easier for one person. After a cold sandwich and a bottle of water, I decided to explore the area. I took my compass and followed a path that sloped downward, guessing it led toward the lake. It did. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, the trees opened up and there was Lake Emory, just as still and quiet as the rest of the woods. It was bigger than I expected, stretching out in both directions with no visible signs of cabins or docks. A couple ducks floated near the reeds. I found a rock near the edge and sat for a while, just watching the water, feeling that strange calm that comes when you're somewhere no one else is. Eventually I headed back, marking a few trees with small strips of orange tape just to be sure I could find my way again. I made some pasta for dinner, cleaned up everything carefully, sealed all the food in a bear-proof container, and placed it about 50 yards from the tent, tied between two trees. I brushed my teeth using bottled water, zipped myself into the tent, and lay there for a while listening to the night sounds. Crickets, owls, wind pushing through the tops of the trees. Sleep came slowly but deeply. I woke up around 3 in the morning. Not from a noise, not from cold, just suddenly awake. I lay there blinking, trying to figure out what had stirred me. I couldn't hear anything. The forest was completely still. Too still. I know how that sounds, but there's a certain hum to the woods, even at night. And this was just silent. No wind, no insects, no rustling. I stayed still, staring into the dark above me. My heart picked up a little. I told myself it was fine, that silence happens, that maybe the wind just died down and the animals settled. Then I heard something, a very soft thump. Not far, not loud, but clear. It didn't sound like an animal. It wasn't fast, like a raccoon or deer stepping on something dry. It was deliberate, heavy, like a footstep, but just one. Then nothing again. I stayed frozen, waiting. I didn't move for maybe 10 minutes, and eventually I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was shining through the fabric of the tent. I sat up fast, rubbed my face, and unzipped the tent, looking around. Everything looked normal. The food container was still in place. The trees looked just as still and quiet. I walked around the area, trying to spot anything unusual. I didn't find anything out of place. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of animals or people. Still, it stuck in my head. That day, I decided to take a longer hike around the lake, this time circling counterclockwise along the ridge that sloped above the waterline. I marked trees again, checked my compass, and carried a pack with water, snacks, and a knife. The trail wasn't clear, but game trails wound through the underbrush, and I followed one that stayed close to the lake. I hiked for a few hours. The terrain was up and down, sometimes dense, sometimes wide open. I saw a snake at one point, but it slithered away. Nothing else much happened. But around mid-afternoon, I found something strange. A small clearing with signs of an old fire pit, maybe 2 years old at most. Rocks still in a circle, blackened in the center. Near it, a torn piece of tarp and the rusted remains of what looked like a folding chair. Nothing fresh, but also not completely decayed. Someone else had camped out here not too long ago. I looked around for anything else, found nothing, and kept moving. Back at camp, I made rice and beans for dinner, read for a while using a flashlight, then tried to sleep early. But again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time I didn't know what time it was. The air inside the tent was cold, colder than the night before, and it was silent again, completely still. I didn't move right away. I waited, listened. I started to think I might just be psyching myself out. Then I heard a noise that made my skin go cold. It was the soft sound of fabric sliding, like something brushing against the side of the tent. It stopped instantly. I stayed frozen, eyes wide open, not breathing. I listened so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. Eventually, I fell asleep like that, curled up, knife in hand, every muscle tense. When the sun came up, I got out fast. I checked the perimeter. I saw something I missed the day before. About 10 feet from the back of my tent, pressed into the soft ground, were 2 impressions. They looked like heel marks. Not deep, but just enough to be noticeable if you looked for them. I crouched there staring at them for a long time, my mouth dry. I packed everything, tent, gear, food, all of it, but I didn't drive out. I left the gear in the car and walked back to the lake. I had this strong urge to see that spot again, the place with the old campfire. I couldn't explain it. I just needed to go back. It took longer to find this time, but I did. I circled the edge of the clearing carefully, looking for anything I might have missed, and I found it. In the brush, just off to the side, half buried in pine needles, was a small black notebook. Water damaged, moldy on the edges. I picked it up and opened it slowly. Most of the pages were ruined, but a few were still readable. It was a journal. Someone had been camping there. I couldn't read much, but what I could make out chilled me. One page said something like, "Third night now. Keep hearing them at night, just outside." Another said, "Went to get water. Felt watched the whole time." The last legible one said, "Can't sleep. Leaving tomorrow morning." That was it. No name, no date, just those fragments. I closed the notebook, took a long breath, and stuffed it in my bag. I walked back fast, never running, but on edge the whole way. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I backed up carefully, turning on the dirt track until I was pointed the right direction, and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I never reported the notebook. I don't know why. Maybe I should have. But I didn't know what to say. I didn't know who left it or when. There was no sign of foul play, no name, no clear date. Just bad vibes and a couple of ruined pages. I still camp sometimes, but not alone and never in unmarked areas. I think a lot about that second night, the soft sound of something brushing the tent. I don't think it was an animal. I don't know who was out there, but someone was. Someone close enough to press a foot into the soft earth and lean against the fabric of my tent in the middle of the night. And the worst part is, I didn't hear them leave. The summer was coming to an end, but I decided to take one last camping trip before the cold weather settled in. I had been itching to get away from the city's noise and chaos for a while. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, flashlight, and extra batteries. I chose a spot deep in the forest, about 3 hours' drive from the nearest town. I wanted a place that felt untouched and quiet, somewhere where I could be alone with nature for a couple of days. The drive there was peaceful. I took back roads lined with tall pines and thick bushes. Birds flew over the open sky, and the air smelled fresh, unlike the city's smoke and dust. I had printed out a paper map just in case my phone lost signal, which I expected it would. The last thing I wanted was to rely on technology in the wild. When I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road. I parked my car in a small clearing near a stream I had read about online. The forest was dense, with thick moss covering the ground and twisted roots snaking over rocks. The smell of pine needles mixed with damp earth filled the air. I unloaded my backpack and set up my tent in a flat spot near the water. I took my time. I wanted everything to be perfect. The tent was old but sturdy, and I had practiced setting it up several times at home. Once the tent was up, I laid out my sleeping bag inside, then unpacked some food. I had brought canned beans, bread, cheese, apples, and a couple of energy bars. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me fed. The stream nearby made a soft, steady sound. It was calming. I used my small stove to boil water for coffee and heated some beans for dinner. As I ate, the sky turned orange, then dark blue. Stars began to appear one by one, bright and clear without the city lights washing them out. I sat on a fallen log, sipping my coffee and watching the sky. The temperature was dropping fast, but I felt good, content to be alone in this quiet place. After cleaning up, I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed. The inside was cozy, and I had a small lantern for light. I checked my phone once more, no signal, just as expected. I settled down, listening to the sounds outside. The wind rustled the leaves, and every now and then, I heard the crack of a branch breaking somewhere nearby. I told myself it was just the forest settling, animals moving around, nothing to worry about. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The forest outside was dark, and the only light came from my small lantern inside the tent. I heard a noise, not the usual rustle or crack of branches, but something closer and slower. A soft crunching sound as if someone or something was stepping carefully through the fallen leaves and twigs just a few meters away. I stayed still, trying not to breathe too loud. My heart started pounding, but I told myself to stay calm. Could be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The stream was right there, so animals came to drink water. The sound went on for a minute or two, then stopped. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I listened closely. Then I heard another noise, this time on the other side of the tent. Something was moving slowly, close to the trees. I grabbed my flashlight carefully and unzipped the tent just a little, enough to peek outside without letting too much cold air in. The beam of light cut through the dark forest. I scanned left and right, but saw nothing at first. Then, across the clearing, I caught the reflection of eyes. A pair of eyes staring back at me. They were low to the ground and wide open. I froze. It was a wild animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, but the eyes seemed too big and steady, not like an animal getting ready to run. I didn't move the flashlight or speak. After a few seconds, the eyes disappeared, and the forest was quiet again. My heart was racing now. I zipped up the tent quickly and sat back against the wall, clutching my flashlight. I told myself this was normal. Wild animals live in the forest. They come close sometimes. I was just lucky to see one up close. But then the noises started again, not just outside the tent, but around the whole clearing. There were footsteps on all sides now, slow and careful. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching, soft sounds like someone walking barefoot. But when I looked out, there was never anyone there. The sounds circled my tent for over an hour. I didn't sleep a bit. I kept the flashlight close and waited for first light. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent all the way and stepped outside. The forest looked peaceful again. The animals had vanished, the sounds gone. I felt relief but also unease. Something was not right. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. On my way back to the car, I noticed strange marks on the trees. Scratches in the bark, deep and jagged, about 5 or 6 feet off the ground. They looked fresh. I hadn't noticed them when I arrived. Closer to the car, I saw more marks, this time on rocks and the ground. There were footprints too, but they weren't animal prints. They looked human but oddly shaped and spaced, like someone walking quietly and deliberately. I paused and looked around. The forest was silent again, but I had the feeling someone had been there, watching me. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where the noise and people made me feel safe again. Later, I called the park ranger's office to report the strange marks and noises. They told me other campers had reported similar things. Unexplained footsteps, signs that someone might be lurking near campsites, but no one had ever been caught or found. I never went back to that forest. I kept my camping trips to places where I could at least get a signal and no others were nearby. The experience left me shaken but taught me to trust my instincts. Sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't ghosts or monsters. They are real people. People you don't see until it's too late. I decided to go camping by myself in early September of 2018. I had some time off work, and I'd been feeling stuck in a routine, just home, work, sleep, repeat. I needed a break from all the screens and noise and people, and going into the woods felt like the only way to reset. I didn't want to go to any crowded campgrounds either. I found a lesser-known trail near Elk Ridge in Colorado while looking through hiking forums. Someone had mentioned a small clearing next to a stream about 6 miles off a forest access road. They said it was quiet, peaceful, and hardly anyone ever went that deep in. That's exactly what I was looking for. I drove up from Durango in my old Tacoma, loaded up with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, canned food, small propane stove, axe, flashlight, bear spray, and a journal. I liked to write stuff down when I camped. There was no phone service out there, and I actually looked forward to that. I left early in the morning and reached the forest road by about 10:30 a.m. From there, it took another hour of slow driving on a rough, rocky path. I kept following the directions I'd found, past a bend with a fallen tree, then left where the road split near a pile of boulders. Finally, I parked just off the trailhead. There weren't any signs, just a small patch of flattened grass that told me someone had parked there before. I put on my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but I could still see where people had walked it before. It cut through thick pine and spruce, winding up and down small hills until it dropped into a shallow valley. I passed a few animal tracks and piles of scat, probably deer or elk, but nothing fresh. The air smelled like sap and old leaves, and the only sound was the wind and the crunch of my boots. About 2 hours in, I found the clearing. It was just like the post had described. A flat space covered in pine needles, with a slow-moving stream at one edge and thick trees all around. No trash, no fire rings, no sign that anyone had camped there in a long time. I dropped my pack and stood still for a while, just listening. No cars, no people, no distant engine noises. Just birds and the water. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, not too close to the stream, and took a few minutes to walk around. The forest was thick but not hard to move through. I found a fallen tree that I could use as a bench and a small rise that gave me a decent view through the trees. It was exactly what I'd wanted. That first afternoon, I gathered some dry wood, filtered a few liters of water, and heated up a can of chili. I wrote a few pages in my journal, mostly about the trail and how good it felt to be alone. The sun set behind the trees earlier than I expected, and it got cold fast. I built a small fire and sat there watching the flames until the stars came out. That night, I slept pretty well. I woke up a couple times when the wind picked up, but I didn't hear anything strange. The next day, I did a bit of exploring. I followed the stream for a while, and it curved through a thicker patch of woods before disappearing behind some rocks. I marked a few trees with sticks so I wouldn't get turned around. The forest felt alive but not threatening. Squirrels, birds, a couple deer in the distance. I spent most of the day hiking and taking notes in my journal. By the time I got back to camp, I was tired but relaxed. I made dinner and sat by the fire again, watching the sky turn dark. That second night, something woke me up around 3 a.m. It wasn't a loud noise, just something different. It was dead silent. No wind, no insects, no birds, just total stillness. That kind of silence is rare in the woods. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. My heart was beating harder than it should have been. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it at the mesh door of the tent, but I couldn't see anything. Still, I had that crawling feeling you get when someone's looking at you. I waited a while, listening, but eventually forced myself to lie back down. I didn't fall asleep again until almost dawn. The next morning, I walked a wide circle around the clearing, just to check for tracks or animals. Nothing looked out of place. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I just imagined it. Still, the uneasiness stayed with me. I didn't feel like writing that day. I didn't explore either. I just stayed near camp, doing little things like tightening my guy lines, collecting more wood, checking my food supply. I started to notice how quiet it was during the day too. Too quiet. I didn't hear birds anymore, not like I did the first day. And the deer I'd seen before weren't around. It was like the forest had emptied out. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the tent with my flashlight off, listening. Around midnight, I heard something. Not loud, but definite, twigs snapping in the trees. Slow, spaced-out steps. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my bear spray. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want whatever it was to see me clearly. The footsteps stopped for a while, then started again, closer. It sounded like a person walking barefoot or in soft shoes. Not heavy like a deer, not fast like a coyote. Just slow, deliberate steps circling the clearing. I stayed perfectly still. Whoever or whatever it was didn't come into the clearing. After maybe 10 minutes, the sound faded into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The second the sun rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I scanned the ground all around the site. I found something near the trees, an old boot print. It wasn't mine. It looked like it had been made recently, not more than a few hours ago. The tread was worn flat, and it pointed straight toward my tent from the woods. I packed up my things right then and there, but I made a mistake. I didn't go back the way I came. I was so focused on getting out fast that I decided to cut across the forest toward where I thought the road was. I thought I could save time, maybe reach the truck quicker. I had a compass and a map, and I figured I'd be fine. But the terrain was rougher than I remembered, and I kept having to detour around fallen trees and thick brush. Hours passed. I stopped once to drink water and rest, but I didn't feel safe even then. I kept checking over my shoulder. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. Eventually, I realized I was going in circles. I saw one of the trees I'd marked earlier near the stream. I must have looped without knowing. That's when I really started to panic. I couldn't hear the stream anymore. I wasn't sure which direction I'd come from. I sat down and forced myself to calm down. I looked at the sun, checked my compass again, and tried to figure out the right direction. I gave myself a goal: walk straight east until I hit the forest road. No more guessing. I walked for what felt like hours. The light started to fade again, and I knew I had maybe an hour before sunset. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. A small pile of bones under a tree, picked clean. They looked like deer bones at first, but when I got closer, I saw something worse. Shreds of a blue hiking jacket, torn and faded. Nearby, there was an old backpack, half buried in leaves. I didn't touch it. I didn't stop. I just kept walking. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just pushed straight east, crashing through undergrowth, climbing over rocks, not caring if I made noise. Right before the sun disappeared, I finally saw the dirt forest road through the trees. My legs were shaking when I stepped onto it. I followed it back to my truck and found it just like I left it, untouched. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started it without even taking off my pack. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station back near town. I didn't report what I found. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself I wasn't sure what I saw, that maybe it was just a dead animal with some old gear nearby. But that wasn't the truth. I knew what I saw. I knew what could have happened if I stayed one more night. Since then, I haven't camped alone again. I still go out into the woods, but only with other people and only in places I know. I still think about that third night sometimes, how something or someone walked circles around my tent, how quiet the forest got, and how the only sign left behind was one single boot print pointed right at me. I learned something from that trip. Nature is beautiful and peaceful, but it's not empty. Just because we can't see something doesn't mean it's not watching. I wasn't followed back. Nothing came to my house or called out from the woods, but the feeling stayed with me, and it always will. I got lucky. That's the only reason I'm still here to write this down. I had been waiting for a break like that for months. Things had been rough at work, and I needed a way to clear my head. I didn't want to go anywhere crowded or noisy. I didn't want beaches or bars or family resorts. I just wanted to get away from everything. Somewhere quiet, somewhere with no cell service, no emails, no calls. Just trees, a tent, and maybe a small campfire. So when I finally got a 4-day weekend, I packed up and headed out early Friday morning. I chose a camping spot in Oregon I'd never been to before, deep in the Umatilla National Forest. It was off a narrow dirt road I found while scrolling through an old hiking forum. Not many reviews, no photos. That's what made it perfect. I left Portland around 6 a.m. and reached the forest by early afternoon. The last stretch of the drive was a winding dirt trail with tall pine trees on both sides and barely enough room for my Subaru. The deeper I drove in, the more isolated it felt. No other cars, no tire marks, just a quiet, peaceful stretch of woods that looked like no one had camped there in a long time. I found a small clearing about 2 miles off the main road, hidden behind some tall brush. It had a natural fire ring made of stones, a spot of flat ground for my tent, and a small creek a short walk away. Felt perfect. The air was clean and still. Everything smelled like pine and damp moss. I took my time setting up the tent and organizing my gear. I had a cooler full of food, plenty of water, a knife, hatchet, and a bare canister I tied up in a tree just in case. I walked around the area for a while, stretching my legs after the long drive. I didn't see or hear anything besides birds and squirrels. No signs of other people. No distant engine hum. Just quiet. That night, I made a small fire, cooked some sausages on a pan, and sat in my camp chair with a cheap paperback. Around 10, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. The forest was dead silent, and I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I made coffee on my camp stove and ate a granola bar before heading out for a hike. I had found an old trail near the clearing. It was overgrown but still visible in parts. I followed it for a few miles, climbing over fallen trees and ducking under low branches. I saw animal tracks in the mud, deer mostly, maybe a coyote. Nothing unusual. On the way back, I took a slightly different route and ended up in a part of the woods I hadn't seen before. That's when I found the tree. It was a big pine, thicker than any of the others nearby. First, it didn't look odd. Then I noticed something about 5 feet up the trunk. It was an old nylon rope, tied tightly around the tree and frayed in some spots. The other end of the rope was buried under moss and leaves at the base. I followed it with my hand, brushing aside debris until I found what it was attached to. It was a rusted metal object, like a U-shaped bar with hinges. Took me a second to realize it was a leg shackle. Not the kind used for camping or gear, this was a restraint. It looked old but strong. The metal was thick, and the locking mechanism was still mostly intact. I stared at it for a long time, not really sure what to think. It didn't make sense. Why would something like that be in the middle of the forest? I looked around more carefully after that. Behind the tree, the ground sloped downward a bit. I followed it and found an old tarp partially buried under pine needles and mud. I pulled at a corner and uncovered a pile of junk. Rotted shoes, torn pieces of flannel, broken glass, some empty food cans. It looked like someone had camped there a long time ago, or lived there, but there was no tent frame, no tools, no clear sign of when or why. It just felt wrong. I backed away slowly, heart starting to pound harder. I don't know why it hit me like that. Maybe the restraint, maybe the silence. Something about it felt unnatural, not like ghosts or monsters, but like something bad had happened there, and I wasn't supposed to find it. I made my way back to camp, keeping my ears open. I didn't see anything on the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every snapping branch or rustling leaf made me flinch. When I got back, I double-checked all my gear, retied the bear canister even higher, and kept the fire going for longer than usual. I didn't sleep much that night. On Sunday morning, I told myself I was overthinking it, probably just remnants from an old hunter's setup, or maybe a squatter's camp. Still weird, but nothing dangerous now. I ate breakfast and decided to explore the area in the other direction, opposite from where I found the shackle. About a mile out, I found another old trail, less overgrown but still clearly unused. I followed it until I found a ridge with a partial view through the trees. Below, tucked into the trees, was a small wooden structure. Not a cabin, more like a shed. It was mostly hidden by brush and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I climbed down carefully and made my way to it. It was locked with a thick chain and padlock, but the wood around the door had rotted in places. I circled around and peeked through a crack in the wall. Inside, I saw a pile of sleeping bags, a few plastic containers, and what looked like empty water jugs. There was also a shovel, a coil of rope, and what looked like animal bones. Small ones, maybe rabbits, maybe not. I didn't go inside. I didn't want to. I turned and hiked back to camp quickly, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. I kept telling myself it didn't mean anything, that people leave weird stuff in the woods all the time, that no one had been there for years. But I couldn't convince myself. When I got back to camp, I packed up. I wasn't supposed to leave until Monday, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't eat lunch, didn't sit to rest. I stuffed everything into my car, stamped out the fire pit, and got ready to leave. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, fresh ones, deep in the mud near the back of my tent. I hadn't gone back there since I arrived. They hadn't been there before. They circled the tent, passed near the fire pit, then disappeared into the woods in the direction of the shack. I froze and stared at them for a long time, trying to think. My car was running, and I had everything I needed. I should have gotten in and driven off right away, but I kept listening, scanning the trees. Then I heard a stick snap, sharp and clear, somewhere off to the left. Not close, but not far. It wasn't a squirrel. It wasn't a falling branch. It was the sound of a footstep. I didn't run. I walked calmly to the car, opened the door, and got in. I turned it around carefully on the narrow trail, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't see anyone. But I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement again 2 hours later. I didn't pull over, didn't answer my phone, didn't stop for gas until I reached a town with lots of lights and people. I didn't report it to the police. What would I say? That I found a shackle and an old shed? That someone walked near my tent? It wasn't illegal to be in those woods, and I hadn't seen anyone clearly. I didn't even have photos, just a weird gut feeling and some old junk that could have belonged to anyone. But I never went back to that part of Oregon. I still go camping sometimes, but only in places with other people nearby. No more dirt roads with no tire marks. No more hidden clearings. A few months after I got back, I looked up that section of the forest again. I found an article buried in a local news site from about 6 years earlier. A man had been arrested for keeping an illegal cabin in the Umatilla forest. He was living off-grid. No ID, no family. He had food caches, weapons, and a shed where they found undisclosed evidence of criminal activity. That's all the article said. No charges stuck. He disappeared before trial. The photos in the article showed the same shed I saw. Same clearing. Same thick pine trees. I haven't camped alone since. I hadn't planned on camping that weekend. It was one of those decisions that happen when your week feels like a blur and you're just trying to escape something, even if you don't know what it is. I've been working long shifts, barely sleeping, just dragging through each day. I think I told myself that some time alone in nature would clear my head. Maybe it would help me sleep better. Maybe I just wanted to sit near a fire and hear nothing but the wind through the trees. Whatever the reason, I threw my gear into the back of the truck on Friday afternoon, filled the cooler with some simple food, and drove north into the woods. The spot I picked was a few miles past a state forest boundary in Wisconsin. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat clearing near a small lake that I'd come across once before while hiking. No bathrooms, no trail markers, no other people. That was exactly what I wanted. It was late April, cold at night but warm enough during the day, and the snow had just fully melted. The trees were still thin, with only the start of spring buds, so the woods looked open and bare in a way that made it feel like everything could see everything else. I parked off an old logging road and hiked in about half a mile. The trail was narrow and slightly overgrown, but I could still follow the tire marks and old boot prints that cut through the trees. I reached the lake just before sunset. The water was still and glassy, and the air smelled like damp moss and wet leaves. I dropped my pack on the ground and started setting up my tent. It was a small one-man setup, nothing fancy, just something to keep the wind and bugs out. I found a good flat patch of dirt a little back from the shore, cleared some sticks, and staked it down. After that, I gathered some wood, built a small fire ring out of rocks, and got a fire going. I cooked a couple hot dogs over the flames, drank one beer, and sat on a log near the water while the sky faded to deep blue. There was no sound except frogs calling from the far end of the lake and the occasional rustle of something in the trees. It was peaceful. I didn't even check my phone. There wasn't a signal out there anyway. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up around 3 a.m. needing to pee and stepped outside to a cold, quiet darkness. The fire had gone out, and my breath puffed out white in the air. I walked to the tree line, did my business, and stood there for a minute looking up at the stars. They were brighter than anything I'd seen back in town. It was so quiet that I could hear the blood in my ears. After a few minutes, I crawled back into the tent and fell asleep again. The next morning, I made oatmeal on my little camp stove and sat by the water with a cup of coffee. The sun came up behind the trees and lit the whole lake in soft orange light. I spent the morning hiking around the shoreline. There wasn't much to see, just trees, reeds, and old driftwood, but I liked the solitude. Around noon, I came back to camp and noticed something that made me pause. There were boot prints near the fire ring that weren't mine. They were deep, fresh, and pointed toward the tent. At first I thought maybe I had made them myself and just didn't remember, but the tread didn't match my boots. These had a different pattern, wider lines, more spaced out. I walked around the clearing slowly, looking at the ground. There were more prints circling the site, like someone had come in from the trees, walked a loop around the tent and fire, and left again. I I followed them back into the woods for a few yards, but they faded quickly on the dry ground. I stood there for a long time just listening. There was nothing. No birds, no wind, just a weird stillness. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but I told myself it could have been a hunter. Maybe someone just passing through early in the morning. It wasn't public land, technically, but people still hiked or hunted there sometimes. I tried to shake it off and went back to camp. I spent the rest of the day chopping wood and fishing a little, even though I didn't catch anything. I didn't go far from the tent. That night, I made another fire, ate a sandwich, and sat closer to the flames. I kept looking into the trees, listening hard for anything that didn't sound normal. Every little snap of a branch made me stiffen up. I stayed up late until the fire died down to glowing coals, and then I climbed into the tent. I kept my knife in the sleeping bag with me. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone walking around out there, watching the tent from the trees. I kept hearing things, soft crunches, low rustles. I couldn't tell if it was animals or just my brain making things up. Around 4 a.m., I heard something that didn't feel like imagination. It was the sound of breathing close. Not deep, loud breaths, but soft, steady inhales and exhales, like someone trying to be quiet. It was right outside the tent wall. I didn't move. I stayed frozen in my bag, barely breathing, eyes wide open in the dark. The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear anything walk away, just silence. I stayed like that until the sky started to lighten. When I finally sat up and unzipped the tent, there was nothing there. No prints, no signs of anyone. I walked in a wide circle around the clearing. Still nothing, but I knew what I'd heard. I was done. I packed everything fast, barely ate, shoved everything into my pack, and started back to the truck. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. The woods were still silent, too silent. No birds, no chipmunks, just that same heavy quiet that had started the day before. When I got to the logging road and saw my truck still there, I felt a wave of relief. I threw the gear in the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. Then I sat there for a second, catching my breath. As I started the truck and backed up to turn around, I saw something in the rearview mirror that froze me. On a tree about 10 yards behind where I'd parked, there was something hanging. I got out slowly and walked to it. It was a small bundle of twigs tied together with red thread, hanging from a nail driven into the bark. It looked like it had been placed carefully, not like it had been there long. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it, heart pounding. It didn't look like garbage or something random. It looked deliberate, like someone had left it there for a reason. Maybe as a marker, maybe as a warning. I don't know. I got back in the truck, turned around, and drove down the narrow road fast, scraping branches as I went. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and even then I didn't feel calm. I didn't feel anything except this dull tightness in my chest. When I got home, I unpacked and put everything away, but I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the sound of breathing and those footprints, and that thing hanging in the tree. I went online and looked up signs of illegal camps, weird markers in the woods, anything. Most of it was junk, stories about cryptids, cults, old legends. But I did find something buried deep in a forum about rural Wisconsin. A guy posted about seeing similar twig bundles near trails, and the thread was filled with replies from people who'd found the same things. Some said it was harmless, just a way for locals to mark hunting zones. Others weren't so sure. One post mentioned unregistered squatters living deep in the forests, people who didn't want to be found and who left those signs to warn others away. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know if they meant to hurt me or if they were just watching, but I know someone was there. I heard them. I saw the footprints, and I've never been back to that spot. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone and never off the grid like that. That weekend shook something loose in me, something quiet but permanent. It's like once you realize someone can be that close, silently watching you through thin nylon walls, you can't ever unknow it. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about a real person, someone who walked into my camp while I slept, stood close enough to breathe on my tent, and then left without a trace. That's what makes it worse. because people are real, and people can choose to do anything. I had been planning the camping trip for almost a month. Work had been eating away at me for weeks, and I needed a break. Not just a weekend at home doing laundry or running errands, but something that took me away from all of it. I had grown up camping a lot with my dad, and I remembered how those trips felt. Quiet mornings, the smell of pine, the cold air hitting your face when you crawl out of the sleeping bag. I missed that, so I picked a long weekend in late September, took Friday and Monday off, and decided I'd head up north into central Idaho. I found a remote trail on an old hiking forum, one that led to a small, seldom-used campsite near a shallow lake. There wasn't even an official name for it. The post just called it Dead End Lake, because it sat at the end of a narrow forest path that didn't connect to anything else. I packed the truck the night before I left: tent, tarp, cook stove, cooler full of food, bear spray, headlamp, compass, topo maps, knife, 2 water filters, extra fuel, and a small first aid kit. I didn't plan to see anyone out there, but I still made sure I had everything. Cell service would be non-existent that deep into the woods. I left at 5 in the morning and made it to the forest road by about 10. The dirt path was rough, full of ruts and potholes. I had to slow to a crawl at a few points to avoid bottoming out. The GPS map on my phone froze up as soon as I passed a certain point, but I had already downloaded the offline maps, and I had a printed version just in case. After a little over an hour of bumping along that miserable road, I reached the tiny clearing where I'd leave my truck. There was barely enough room to turn around. From there, I loaded up my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail had probably once been maintained, but was now little more than a narrow dirt ribbon pressed through thick trees and underbrush. There were signs that animals passed through, old scat piles, broken branches, even a set of mountain lion tracks that looked a few days old. I kept my bear spray strapped to the outside of my pack, just in case. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I reached the lake. It was exactly as the post described: small, maybe a few hundred feet across, still, quiet, and ringed with tall pine trees. There was a slight slope down to the water, and a few areas where the grass had been flattened, likely from old tents. I picked a spot slightly uphill with a good view of the lake and no dead trees overhead. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and got to work setting up camp. The rest of that first day went smoothly. I set up the tent, made a small fire, boiled water from the lake to be safe, and cooked a simple meal. It was cold once the sun went down, and I ended up sitting close to the fire just to stay warm. By the time I climbed into my sleeping bag, it was already close to midnight. I didn't fall asleep right away. It always takes me a while to get used to the sounds of the forest again. Owls, rustling in the leaves, branches creaking. Normal stuff. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up needing to pee. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped outside. The air was freezing. I could see my breath in the beam of the light. The lake looked like glass, and the forest was completely still. I went about 10 feet away from the tent, took care of things, and turned to head back in. That's when I noticed something odd. There were faint marks in the dirt around my tent. At first, I thought they were just mine from earlier, but as I looked closer, I saw a pattern. These weren't boot prints, they were lighter, shallower, almost like someone or something had been barefoot. The prints were scattered, uneven. A few looked like they came from different directions, circling the tent loosely, never getting too close. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. The beam from my headlamp wasn't strong enough to show anything beyond a few feet, and I didn't like the idea of walking out there to follow them in the dark. Eventually, I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe they were animal tracks, distorted by the dirt. It was late. I was tired. I got back in the tent, zipped everything tight, and laid still for a long time before I could fall asleep again. The next morning, I walked the edge of the lake and tried to find any other signs. Fresh prints, broken branches, anything that suggested someone else had been there. But there was nothing, not even a candy wrapper or a bent piece of metal. The place looked untouched. I tried to tell myself it was all just my imagination playing games with me in the dark. I spent the day fishing with a collapsible rod I had packed. The fish weren't biting, but it was still relaxing. I cooked lunch on the stove and explored a bit more of the area around the campsite. Everything seemed normal. I made a point to stay close, though. I didn't want to get turned around. There were no trail markers or cairns, and the tree cover was dense. Even with a compass, it would be easy to get lost. I made another fire that night and went to bed a little earlier. I hadn't heard or seen anything strange since the night before. Just after 2 in the morning, I woke up again. No sound had woken me, but I felt wide awake like something had pulled me out of a dream. I lay still and listened. There was nothing at first, just the faint sound of wind in the trees. Then I heard a soft crunch. Not close, not far. Just one sound, then nothing. A few seconds later, another crunch. It wasn't a large sound, not like something crashing through the brush. It was more like the careful step of something or someone trying not to be heard. Then another, and another, came from the direction of the lake. I held my breath and reached slowly for my headlamp. I didn't turn it on. I just held it, frozen, listening. The footsteps continued for a while. Slow, irregular. Then they stopped. Total silence. I waited a long time, longer than I can remember. My heart was pounding. Finally, I turned on the headlamp and quickly unzipped the tent flap. I pointed the beam toward the lake. Nothing. The water was still. No movement. No animals. No one. But I didn't sleep after that. By the time the sun came up, I had already packed most of my gear. I didn't feel safe staying. Something wasn't right. Whether it was a person or an animal, I didn't want to wait around and find out. I stuffed the rest of my things into my pack, double-checked the area to make sure I hadn't left anything, and started back the way I came. About 20 minutes into the hike, I noticed something strange. A small piece of blue cloth was caught on a branch just off the trail. It looked like part of a jacket or backpack, but I hadn't worn anything blue, and this wasn't here when I came in. I stopped and looked around. I couldn't see anything else. No signs of other campers, no fresh boot prints, nothing. I took a few steps off the trail to check it out. It was old, faded. It looked like it had been there for a while. I backed away and kept moving. About 2 hours later, I reached a fork I didn't remember. I pulled out my map. There shouldn't have been any forks. I was sure of it. I hadn't left the trail. I compared it with the compass. It didn't make sense. Both paths looked the same, narrow, overgrown, surrounded by thick trees. I picked the one that felt right and kept walking, but the deeper I went, the more uncertain I felt. The trail began to slope downhill sharply, which didn't match my memory of the hike in. I should have been gradually descending the whole time, but now I was almost sliding down in spots. I stopped and checked the map again, but the landmarks were too vague. Trees, elevation lines, a small creek. None of it helped. I kept walking, hoping I'd hit the dirt road, but I didn't. An hour passed, then another. I was sweating, running low on water, and the forest was starting to feel claustrophobic. I finally admitted I was lost. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. I didn't see any of the markers I had noticed before. No fallen tree with the moss-covered root. No rock shaped like a wedge. Everything was trees, dirt, and silence. I sat down, forced myself to eat a granola bar, and tried to think clearly. I decided to follow the slope downhill. In most forests, water flows downhill, and roads are often built near streams or valleys. I followed that direction, careful to mark trees with a small knife as I went, carving shallow slashes just to help track my path. After about 40 minutes, I started hearing water. A steady trickle at first, then the clearer sound of flowing. I found a creek, not a big one, but clear and cold. I filled my bottle, filtered it, and drank. I followed the creek for another hour. That's when I found the shoes. They were half buried in the mud near the edge of the water. Hiking boots, laces still tied. One looked like it had been dragged. There were no feet in them, just the boots. And near them, a torn piece of flannel, red and black, soaked and stuck to a branch. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch anything. I kept walking. Not long after that, I found a rough clearing with a collapsed tent. It had been there for a long time. Months, maybe longer. The fabric was rotting, the poles snapped. Nearby, there were rusted cans, torn fabric, and a fire ring filled with old ash. I had planned this trip for months. After a long stretch of work and city noise, I wanted nothing more than to escape to the woods, to find some quiet and peace for a few days. I picked a small, lesser-known campground deep in a national forest several hours from the city. The area was supposed to be remote, with few visitors and plenty of trails. The thought of hiking through untouched forest, sleeping under the stars, and living simply for a little while had been calling me. I packed carefully. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, water, a headlamp, extra batteries, and a pocket knife. I had a basic map of the area, but I was confident I could find my way. I set off early on a Saturday morning, my car loaded and ready. The highway eventually gave way to a narrow, winding forest road. The trees closed in on either side, tall and thick, casting shadows even at mid-morning. The smell of pine filled the air, fresh and sharp. As I drove deeper, the air seemed cooler, quieter, with only the hum of the engine and occasional bird calls breaking the silence. Finally, I arrived at the small dirt parking area. Only a handful of cars were there, and some campsites had tents already set up. I picked a spot near a small creek, not far from the parking but still feeling private. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss, and patches of wildflowers sprinkled the forest floor. I pulled my gear out and started setting up the tent. I picked a flat area with some fallen logs nearby to sit on. The trees here were a mix of pine and birch, their white bark glowing slightly in the late afternoon sun. I wanted to make sure I could hear if any animals came close, so I left the tent flap partially open for fresh air, but secured enough to keep bugs out. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The forest was littered with fallen branches, some damp, some dry. I carefully selected smaller twigs and kindling, along with some larger logs. The smell of the wood, dry and earthy, was comforting. I arranged the fire pit stones in a circle, cleared away the pine needles, and used a flint striker to light the kindling. It took a few tries, but soon the fire was crackling, its orange glow flickering against the trees. The smoke rose steadily, the scent of burning wood mixing with the fresh forest air. I cooked a simple dinner of canned beans and rice on my small stove, eating slowly while watching the fire. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls settling down for the night. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in a jacket and sat close to the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my skin. Above, the sky turned a deep navy blue, stars twinkling faintly through the gaps in the canopy. I cleaned up and stowed everything carefully before crawling into my sleeping bag. The forest felt alive but calm. The low hoot of an owl echoed somewhere far off. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting soft shadows on the inside of the tent. I closed my eyes, expecting to fall asleep quickly, tired from the hike and fresh air. But then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, coming from just outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath. The noise came again, slow and deliberate, moving closer. I sat up quietly, trying to listen. There was no shouting or shouting, no talking, just footsteps. I reached for my headlamp and shined it toward the tent's entrance, careful not to make too much noise. Nothing, just the dark forest beyond the mesh screen. The sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. After a few minutes, I thought maybe it had been an animal, a deer or a raccoon, wandering too close. Still, I stayed awake, alert, watching the shadows. Sleep finally came in fits and starts, interrupted by every little sound. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, a distant howl of a coyote. Morning light came early through the trees, pale and soft. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, breathing in the crisp air. The forest looked peaceful in the morning light. Dew clung to the grass and leaves. Birds were already busy chirping and hopping between branches. I packed some gear for a hike, filling my water bottle at the creek. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, with roots twisting out like veins across the dirt. I followed it slowly, enjoying the quiet and the sound of my footsteps on the soft earth. The trees were thick, their trunks rough and scarred. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dancing patterns on the ground. I passed fallen logs covered in moss and patches of wild berries. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a wide view of the valley below. The sky was clear and blue, and I could see the river winding like a silver ribbon. The wind was light and warm on my face. I sat on a rock, resting, drinking some water. The forest felt like a living thing, ancient, steady, and watchful. I didn't see any other people on the trail. The silence was heavy but not unpleasant. It made me aware of every small sound. The flutter of wings, the hum of insects, the distant trickle of water. Later, as the sun climbed higher, I headed back to camp. The forest floor was dry now, leaves crunching underfoot. I started to notice more signs of wildlife. Scratches on trees, scattered feathers, small holes dug into the soil. I found a set of fresh animal tracks near the creek, maybe a fox or a bobcat. It made me smile, feeling part of something wild and natural. Back at camp, I prepared another simple meal and sat by the fire again. As the afternoon faded, I decided to explore a bit further. I took a smaller path leading away from my site, curious where it might lead. The trail became steeper, climbing up a ridge. The trees grew thinner here, and the wind blew stronger. I paused at the top, looking out over the forest canopy. The view was breathtaking. Then I noticed something strange. On the ridge across the valley, among the trees, I saw what looked like a small campsite. A patch of cleared ground with what might have been a tarp or plastic sheet, catching the light. It looked out of place, neat and artificial amid the wild trees. I hadn't seen any other campsites marked on my map in that area. I studied it for a moment. No smoke, no movement, just a quiet clearing. My heart quickened, not out of fear but from a sudden sense of unease. What were people doing so far out here? It wasn't an official site, and there was no path leading there from this side. I didn't linger. I turned back toward my own campsite, the forest feeling a little less welcoming now. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped again. I hurried down the trail, eager to reach the safety of my fire. That night, I made sure the fire was bigger, burning brighter and louder. I piled on extra wood, wanting the warmth and light to keep me safe. The crackling flames cast tall shadows on the trees, flickering and alive. I double-checked the tent, zipped it tight, and lay close, listening. The footsteps came again, this time louder, heavier. They circled the perimeter of the campsite, slow and methodical. Leaves rustled sharply, twigs snapped. I stayed still, my heart racing. The firelight caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the tree line. A shadow, taller than any deer or bear I'd seen before. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell again, thick and pressing. I reached for my pocket knife, holding it tight. I told myself to stay calm, to think clearly. No one had seen me here, no one should be near. I didn't want to imagine the worst, but the feeling of being watched, hunted even, was real. Hours passed. The night stretched on, cold and long. The footsteps never came back. The fire burned low, and dawn finally broke through the trees, pale and soft. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't eat breakfast or linger. I took the shortest route back to my car, glancing over my shoulder the entire way. The forest that had felt peaceful before now seemed dark and uncertain, full of hidden dangers and secrets. When I reached the parking lot, I saw another car there, the first one besides mine. The driver was loading gear into the trunk, glancing nervously at the trees. Our eyes met briefly. Neither of us spoke, but the look said it all. We both knew something was wrong out here. I drove home, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. The city noise was suddenly comforting, normal, safe. I thought about the campsite on the ridge, the footsteps, the shadow. What had I seen? Who had been out there? I told myself I had escaped something dangerous, something real and human. Not ghosts or monsters, but people, maybe criminals or worse, hiding deep in the woods where no one would find them. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what those others were doing out there, or if they ever found someone else. But I learned to I had been looking forward to that trip for a while. It had been a rough few months. Too much time spent inside, work piling up, barely any sunlight or fresh air. So when I finally managed to take a week off in mid-September, I packed up my old Ford Escape, grabbed my gear, and drove 6 hours north into the Sierra Nevada foothills. I'd picked a spot I found on a hiking forum, someplace near a stream a few miles off a Forestry Service road, with no official campground, no signs, no crowds, just trees, dirt, water, and the quiet kind of stillness that lets your ears ring. I reached the trailhead around noon. The weather was decent, cool enough to need a hoodie but not cold. I strapped on my pack and started hiking. The trail was faint and narrow, barely used. I had a printed topo map and had marked a bend near the creek where the land flattened out enough to pitch a tent. It was about 4 miles in. Most of the trail was uphill at first, winding between tall pine and fir, thick with brush on either side. I passed no one, which was how I wanted it. The only sounds were wind and birds. About halfway in, the trail disappeared for a bit. There were a few fallen trees and patches of overgrowth. I stopped, took a drink from my bottle, and reoriented myself with the compass. After a short climb and some careful stepping over loose rocks, I found the trail again. It curved around the ridge and dipped down into the woods, where I followed a dry wash toward the sound of running water. By the time I reached the spot near the stream, the light was softer, more golden. The ground opened into a small clearing bordered by flat rock and moss. The stream ran clear and cold, maybe 15 feet across, with a few small pools and shallow eddies. I could hear fish splashing occasionally. I dropped my pack, stretched, and took in a deep breath. No signs of anyone, not even old fire pits or boot prints. I liked that. I set up my tent just uphill from the water, where the ground was dry and level. I gathered firewood, cleared a small pit, and built a ring of rocks. I had brought a portable stove too, but something about a real fire makes things taste better. As the sun dropped, I boiled water, made a meal, and sat against a log with my feet toward the flames, watching the sky go orange, then purple, then deep blue. The stars were incredible. No light pollution, just sharp, cold points scattered above the treetops. I sat up late, not thinking much, just enjoying the silence. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sounds of the stream and wind in the trees. The next morning, I got up early, stiff but rested. I made coffee, ate a couple of granola bars, and spent the day hiking a loop around the ridge above my camp. The terrain was rough in places, but I liked the workout. I found deer tracks, saw a rabbit, and spooked a hawk from a branch overhead. Around midday, I returned to camp, filtered water from the stream, and just relaxed. I didn't check my phone. I turned it off the moment I got there. I had no service anyway. That second night, something felt off. It started after dark. I was sitting by the fire again, same spot, same routine. The flames were low, and I had a headlamp on, dimmed to conserve battery. I kept hearing small sounds from the trees, things moving around just out of view. Not unusual for the woods, and I've heard animals before, deer, raccoons, even the occasional coyote. But this wasn't that. These weren't footfalls in leaves or the scratch of claws on bark. They were softer, more deliberate, something or someone moving carefully. I turned off my light and listened. Nothing for a while. Then a sound again to my right, maybe 30 feet away. A dry twig snapped. That was more than just a small animal. I stood up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and swept the beam through the woods. Nothing, just trunks and shadow. I waited, heart rate higher than it should have been. Then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a bear moving through. I had food stored in a bear canister well away from the tent, and the fire was still going. Still, I stayed alert, poking at the coals, keeping the light on for longer than usual. I didn't hear anything else that night and eventually went to bed. But I didn't sleep well. Every little sound outside had me wide awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps near the stream, 2 or 3 slow steps. Then nothing. The next morning, I checked the area but found nothing. No prints, no disturbed earth, no broken branches. Still, I felt watched. It was a gut thing. I had that tight feeling in my chest like someone was looking at me from behind. I kept glancing at the tree line. I made breakfast quickly, packed a small day bag, and went farther upriver for a while, trying to distract myself with a change of scenery. I returned by late afternoon. As I came down the ridge toward my camp, something made me stop. My fire pit looked off. I approached slowly. The ring of rocks was broken, scattered a bit. Not by wind or animals, it looked intentional. A couple of the rocks had been moved several feet. One had deep scratches like it had been dragged. That made no sense. Animals wouldn't do that, and I hadn't moved them. I looked around, checking the tent, my gear, everything. Nothing was missing, but someone or something had been there. I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. The woods were silent, not even birdsong. I packed my gear into the tent and sat on a log, scanning the area. I had a small folding knife on me and a hatchet, but neither felt like real protection. I considered leaving early, but the sun was already dipping. Hiking 4 miles out through the woods in the dark wasn't safe, especially with the trail in spots being almost invisible. That night, I didn't make a fire. I sat in the tent with my headlamp on, listening. Every little crack or rustle made my skin crawl. I barely slept, maybe dozed off for a few minutes at a time. At one point, I heard something scrape against the tent fabric. I froze, holding my breath. It didn't happen again, but I didn't move until daylight. When the sun rose, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat. I rolled up the tent, shoved gear into my pack, and started hiking out. I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't stop, didn't take a break. The air felt thick, like the trees themselves were watching. About a mile from the trailhead, I saw something that made me stop cold. On the side of the trail, there was a tree with deep cuts in the bark. Not claw marks, cuts, like someone had used a knife or a hatchet. The lines formed what looked like tally marks, grouped in 5s. There were maybe 7 sets. 35. I don't know what they meant, but they weren't old. The wood beneath the bark was still light and fresh. And near the base of the tree, half buried in pine needles, was a crushed aluminum can. I hadn't brought any cans. That confirmed it. Someone had been out there. Someone watching, waiting. Maybe not just me. Maybe others had been out there before me. The tally marks made me wonder about those others. How many? Why mark them? I didn't want to think about it. I made it back to the car by early afternoon, threw my pack into the back seat, and got out of there as fast as I could. The drive back was a blur. I didn't stop until I hit the first major highway. Didn't even turn my phone on until I saw other cars and gas stations. When I got home, I went through all my gear carefully. Everything was accounted for, nothing missing. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been close to something bad. Someone had been watching me out there. Someone knew I was alone, far from help, and they'd come close enough to touch my tent. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe they were testing how much they could do before I ran. I'll never know. I didn't report it. What would I even say? That someone messed with my fire pit and scratched my tent? No evidence, no faces, no names. Just a heavy feeling that stayed in my chest for days after. I still hike. I still go camping. But I never go alone anymore. I bring others with me, always check in with people, always carry a GPS beacon. I haven't gone back to that place. I never will. Some spots are meant to stay off the map. I had been wanting a break from everything for a while. City life had been wearing me down. The endless noise, work stress, traffic, crowds. I hadn't taken any time off in over a year, so I finally requested a week off work in early October, just when the air started to get crisp, but before it got truly cold. I needed something quiet and remote, a reset. I decided to go camping alone in a spot I found online, Deepwater Ridge, a less traveled area in northern Idaho that someone on a hiking forum had recommended months ago. They said the trails were rarely busy, the lake was beautiful, and it was far enough out to avoid the weekend crowd but still accessible with the right kind of vehicle. I packed my gear over a couple of days. I made sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, fuel, first aid kit, bear spray, fire starter, knife, flashlight, backup flashlight, plenty of batteries, dry food, and water filter. I was being extra cautious. I also downloaded topo maps onto my phone and brought a paper map and compass just in case. I didn't plan on doing anything wild, just a peaceful solo camp near the lake, maybe 2 or 3 nights, then back home. The drive out was long, about 7 hours from Boise. The last hour or so was on an unpaved forest road that kept getting rougher the deeper I went. Tall pines closed in on both sides. Potholes and loose gravel made me go slow. My SUV handled it all right, but I kept thinking about how alone I already felt. No cars had passed me, no people anywhere. I finally pulled off at a small makeshift parking area at the end of the road. From there, it was a 2-mile hike to the lake. I hoisted my pack onto my back and started walking in. The trail was narrow and lightly used, but easy to follow. The forest felt still, only the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional squirrel or bird breaking the silence. About an hour later, I reached the lake. It was stunning. Deep blue water surrounded by trees on all sides, the mountains in the distance starting to get their first dusting of snow. I found a small clearing a few hundred feet from the water and started setting up camp. By the time I pitched the tent, gathered some wood, and got dinner cooking, it was already dusk. I sat by the fire with a warm meal and just stared into the trees. It was the first time in months I felt like I could breathe. No phone signal, no distractions, just quiet. The first night was uneventful. I slept better than I expected. The second day, I woke up to the sound of birds and leaves rustling in the breeze. I spent the morning walking around the lake, taking pictures, filtering some water, and just enjoying the calm. It was around midday that I noticed something that made me pause. On the far side of the lake, maybe 100 yards from the shore, there was what looked like an old fire ring. Blackened rocks arranged in a circle, with some scorched wood in the middle. It wasn't unusual, but the thing that caught my eye was a rusted metal mug sitting beside it. It looked like it had been there a while, but not so long that it had become part of the ground. I figured maybe someone had camped here last season and left it behind. Still, it gave me a weird feeling, like I wasn't the only one who had stumbled upon this spot thinking it was off the grid. I moved on and didn't think much more about it until later that evening. After dinner, I walked a short distance into the woods to bury my trash and use the bathroom. As I was walking back, I noticed something odd near the trail I had made coming in from the lake. It looked like a partial footprint in the soft dirt. Not mine. It was bigger and wider, and the tread pattern was different. I stopped and crouched down to look at it closer. It wasn't fresh, but it didn't look old either. I checked around but didn't see any others nearby. I stood there for a minute, just listening. The forest was quiet, but I had that feeling like someone was watching me. I made my way back to the tent quickly and kept the fire going a bit longer than usual that night. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone else had hiked through recently. I was in a public area after all. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every sound outside the tent seemed amplified. Twigs snapping, wind moving through the trees. Once or twice I thought I heard something heavier, like footsteps, but when I held my breath and listened hard, everything went quiet again. Eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and did my usual check of the area. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The stack of firewood I'd collected the day before had been moved. Not scattered or messed with, just moved. About half of it was gone, and the rest had been stacked neatly a few feet away from where I'd left it. I looked around again. Nothing else was out of place, but the neatness of it unsettled me. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind. Someone had been here. I packed up my food and gear as quickly as I could. I didn't want to overreact, but something wasn't right. I had planned to stay a third night, but now I just wanted to get out. I decided I'd hike back to the car that afternoon instead. I spent the next couple hours breaking down camp, repacking, double-checking that I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was about to start heading back when I heard something up the trail, something snapping and crunching in the trees. I froze. It wasn't a deer or a small animal. It was heavy, deliberate. I waited, heart pounding, trying to see through the trees, but nothing came out. The noise stopped. I grabbed my bear spray and started walking fast, following the path I came in on, constantly looking over my shoulder. About 20 minutes into the hike, I saw something hanging from a branch just off the trail. I stopped. It was a piece of white cloth, maybe a bandana or part of a shirt. It looked like it had been tied there. I hadn't seen it on the way in. I didn't want to get close, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail and looked at it more carefully. It was an old t-shirt sleeve, knotted tight, and someone had drawn a crude symbol on it with a black marker, something that looked like an X with a circle around it. I backed away and got back on the trail. Now I was walking fast, breathing heavy, scanning the woods constantly. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was on the edge. The last half mile felt like it took forever. When I finally saw the trailhead and the edge of the road where I had parked, I let out a shaky breath. But when I got closer, my gut dropped again. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt beside my SUV. Not mine. The pattern was different, and they were deep. Someone had driven in while I was at the lake. My vehicle looked untouched at first, but when I got closer, I saw that someone had tried to open the rear hatch. There were fresh scratches near the lock, and some dirt smudges on the window like someone had pressed their hand or face against it. I unlocked the car, threw my pack in, and got in as fast as I could. I locked the doors and started the engine, pulling out without even catching my breath. As I drove back down the forest road, my hands were shaking. Every time the trees opened up or the road curved, I expected to see someone step out. But I didn't. The road stayed empty all the way back to the main highway. I didn't stop until I hit the next town, an hour later. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the car for a while. The sun was going down, and the clouds were getting low and gray. I thought about everything that had happened, the moved firewood, the strange footprint, the sleeve with the symbol, the sounds in the woods, the tire tracks. None of it was proof of anything, but taken together, it painted a picture that I couldn't ignore. Someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting. Maybe they didn't expect me to leave early. Maybe they were planning to come back that night. I don't know. I didn't call the police. I didn't report anything. I hadn't been hurt. Nothing was stolen. And who would I report it to? A weird vibe in the woods isn't a crime, but I know what I felt. I've been camping my whole life. I've spent time alone in the wild many times before. This was different. This wasn't just nature being unpredictable. Someone was out there. Someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who saw me. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. When I finally did, I chose a public site with other people nearby and a ranger station within walking distance. It's not that I'm scared of the woods. I still love being outdoors. But now I think twice before going somewhere remote alone. Because the scariest thing out there isn't a bear or a storm. It's another person. Someone who knows you're alone. Someone who knows the roads. Someone who knows the trails better than you do. The sun had barely started to dip below the tall pine trees when I arrived at the small clearing deep in the forest. It was late September, and the air already carried that sharp, cold edge that whispered the approach of fall. The forest was quiet except for the rustling of dry leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere far off. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo camping weekend far from the noise of the city. My goal was simple: escape, breathe, and recharge. I wanted nothing but the forest around me, the crackle of a campfire, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I hadn't expected that the woods would test me in ways I hadn't imagined. I parked my old pickup truck on a narrow dirt path just before the clearing and unloaded my gear. The weight of the backpack felt familiar on my shoulders as I carried it into the middle of the clearing. This spot was perfect. Flat, dry ground with a few large rocks around it and tall trees forming a natural wall. I laid out my tent, a compact two-person model, and began setting it up. The fabric smelled faintly of plastic and mildew, but it was sturdy, and I trusted it to keep me dry and safe. Once the tent was up, I gathered firewood. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and dried pine needles. I found plenty of dead wood, the kind that breaks easily and burns well. My hands got scratched and dirty, but I didn't mind. There was something grounding about the simple physical work. When the fire was finally going, its warm glow felt like a small island of comfort in the growing darkness. I cooked some canned beans over the flames, the smell filling the air around me. I ate slowly, listening to the night sounds. The soft hoot of an owl somewhere high above, the distant cry of a coyote, and the steady wind moving through the trees. As the fire died down to glowing embers, I lay back on the ground, my head resting on my backpack, and stared up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, countless, and clear. I could see the Milky Way stretching overhead like a faint cloud. It was moments like this that made me feel both incredibly small and strangely connected to everything around me. But soon, the peacefulness started to shift. Around midnight, I was woken by the faint sound of something moving outside the clearing. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noises didn't sound quite right. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like footsteps, soft but steady. The sound circled the clearing, pausing now and then. I froze, trying to tell if it was just my imagination, but there it was again, the unmistakable crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I sat up, heart beating faster. My flashlight was inside the tent, and I hesitated to reach for it. The night felt deeper now, darker and colder, as if the forest was holding its breath. The footsteps moved closer to the edge of the clearing, circling around me. I could hear a low rustle in the bushes near the firewood pile. A chill ran down my spine. I gripped my small folding knife inside the tent, but tried to keep my breathing steady. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like forever, listening hard. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the noise vanished. The forest returned to its normal nighttime chorus, and the fire embers were cold. I wanted to believe it was just some animal passing by, but my gut told me something was off. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Morning came slowly, with pale sunlight filtering through the tall pines. I emerged from my tent, still uneasy but determined to carry on. I checked the perimeter of the clearing and found fresh footprints, human footprints. They weren't large, maybe from someone my size or smaller. They circled around the edge of the clearing, just like the footsteps I heard at night. Whoever it was had been watching me, lurking nearby. I packed my things quickly, deciding not to stay another night. The isolation I had sought now felt dangerous. As I made my way back to the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees pressing around the narrow path. The footprints followed me, stopping a few dozen feet behind at intervals. I didn't stop to check. I didn't want to see if someone was still out there. By the time I reached my truck, the adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a heavy exhaustion. I locked the doors and started the engine, the truck's headlights cutting through the dim forest light as I pulled back onto the dirt road. The forest was silent once again, but the memory of those footsteps stayed with me. A reminder that sometimes the wilderness isn't just wild animals. It's other people, and sometimes they aren't friendly. The drive back was long and quiet. When I finally reached the highway and the familiar buzz of traffic, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't speak about the night, didn't tell anyone what I'd heard or seen, but that trip changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. It taught me to respect the silence, but also to be aware that I'm never truly alone, and that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see, but you can feel watching you, waiting just beyond the firelight. The forest was dense and quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I had driven for hours on a narrow, winding road until it ended at a small dirt path that led to the cabin I had rented for the week. The place was isolated, tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. I needed to get away from the noise, the people, and the constant buzz of city life. My plan was simple: spend 7 days alone in that cabin, disconnect, and maybe write a little. I never imagined it would become one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Built from dark, weathered logs, it had a steep roof covered in moss and a small stone chimney. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. The air smelled like pine mixed with a faint hint of mildew, which wasn't surprising given the cabin's age and its proximity to the forest floor. The inside was small and sparse. A wood stove on one side, a simple wooden table with a couple of chairs, a bed pushed into the corner, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink and some cupboards. Dust coated everything, and the windows were slightly grimy, letting in soft, filtered light from the dense trees outside. I set my backpack down, lit the stove, and started unpacking. The first night, I ate canned beans heated on the stove and read by the weak light of a battery-powered lantern. Outside, the woods were thick shadows, broken only by the occasional flicker of moonlight. The sounds of crickets and the wind weaving through the branches filled the silence. I felt calm, even comforted by the quiet, after months of the city's chaos. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense with tall pines and thick underbrush. Fallen leaves and broken twigs crunched under my boots as I walked slowly, soaking in the smells and sounds. I found a small creek a few hundred feet away, its water clear and cold. The sun filtered through the trees, casting sharp, shifting patterns on the ground. The place felt untouched, like it had been waiting for someone to come and simply exist within it. I liked that feeling. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon chopping wood and stacking it carefully by the door. I wanted to keep the stove going easily, especially when night came early. I fixed a simple dinner and settled in with a notebook, trying to write about the forest, the cabin, the strange peace I felt. The words came slowly at first, but then they started to flow. The isolation brought clarity. I thought this would be easy. On the third night, something shifted. I was sitting by the stove, the lantern's light casting long shadows against the walls. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows. I had just finished jotting down some notes when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a branch against the cabin's roof or siding, but it kept coming, steady and deliberate. I set my notebook down and listened. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere near the back of the cabin. My heart quickened. I reminded myself I was alone and there was no reason to be scared. Maybe an animal, maybe a woodpecker. Still, the sound was too consistent to be random. I grabbed the small flashlight from the table and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold night air hit me sharply. The forest was dark and silent except for the thumping. It was coming from the tree line a few yards behind the cabin. I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. No glowing eyes, no shapes, just blackness. I stayed there for a few minutes, waiting, but the sound stopped. I shrugged it off as my imagination, convinced it was probably a woodpecker or some other bird, then went back inside, locked the door and closed the windows. Sleep was hard to come by that night. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind made me tense up. I kept imagining footsteps outside or someone watching me from the trees. When morning finally came, I felt drained but told myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped more wood, cleaned up a little, and avoided wandering too far into the woods. The silence was no longer comforting. It felt oppressive. Even the birds seemed quieter than before. Later in the afternoon, I noticed something odd on the porch, a set of footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were bigger and deeper, like someone heavier had stepped there, but there was no way anyone had come without me noticing. I checked all around the cabin, but the forest floor was undisturbed except for my own tracks and these footprints on the porch. Panic flickered for a moment, but I forced myself to stay calm. The cabin was locked, the windows shut tight. Whoever left those prints hadn't come close to the door or windows. Maybe they had walked past on the other side of the cabin or were just passing through the woods nearby. I took a photo of the footprints with my phone, thinking I might show it to someone when I got back to town. After that, I made sure to double-check the locks and keep my flashlight within reach. The sun set, and I lit the stove, my eyes constantly scanning the dark outside. That night, the thumping returned, louder and more persistent. It sounded like something hitting a tree repeatedly, like a knock or a hammer blow. It went on for several minutes before stopping suddenly. I didn't dare go outside. Instead, I sat as still as possible, listening for anything else. In the middle of the night, I heard a sharp crack nearby, like a branch breaking underfoot. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I stayed frozen, holding my breath, waiting. Nothing else happened, but sleep didn't come. The following morning, I found more footprints around the cabin, some closer to the windows. They were fresh, and it was clear whoever had been near had moved slowly and carefully, avoiding leaving obvious tracks. Something wasn't right. I realized I wasn't just dealing with the solitude of the woods anymore. Someone had been close to the cabin during the night. The thought sent a wave of unease over me. I was alone, miles from anyone, with no easy way to get help if I needed it. Despite the fear, I refused to leave. I had come here for peace, and I was going to stay for the week no matter what. I started preparing for the worst, keeping the stove fire going, barricading the door with a heavy chair, and sharpening a small kitchen knife I had brought for emergencies. The next few days passed in a strange blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Each night, the thumping noises grew louder and more frequent. Sometimes I would hear soft footsteps crunching in the leaves around the cabin, but whenever I shone the flashlight outside, no one was there. The forest, once inviting and calm, felt alive in a menacing way. The shadows seemed to move just out of sight. Every snapping twig made me jump. My sleep was broken into short bursts, filled with dreams of being watched, trapped. On the 5th day, I woke up to find the cabin door scratched up. Deep, jagged marks gouged into the wood, like someone had tried to force their way in. I ran my hand over the splinters and felt a cold shiver run through me. It was proof someone had tried to get inside. I called the local ranger station from my phone, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. The isolation was absolute. I was completely cut off. That day, I stayed inside, barricading myself in as best I could. I rationed my food and water carefully. The thumping noises never stopped. Sometimes they were rhythmic, like deliberate knocks, and other times random and erratic, like frustration or warning. On the 6th night, the thumping changed. It came as a slow, steady pounding louder than before, right outside the cabin walls. I pressed my ear against the cold wood and could feel the vibrations. I was sure someone was trying to break in. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently. My breath caught. The door shook as someone pushed against it with all their strength. I pushed back with the chair, but the door creaked and bowed under the pressure. I grabbed the knife and prepared to defend myself. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was worse, thick, heavy, like waiting for something terrible to happen. Hours passed. I stayed frozen, knife in hand, listening to every sound. At dawn, the door was still intact. The marks from the night before were deeper now, but the chair had held. I slowly opened a window to look outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just a few feet from the cabin, were several pairs of heavy boots. They were arranged as if someone had been standing there for hours, waiting. The ground around them was disturbed and flattened like a small campsite. Empty cans, scraps of cloth, a broken flashlight lay scattered in the dirt. I understood then. Whoever had been out there wasn't trying to scare me for fun. They had been living in the woods nearby, watching me, waiting for the right moment. They were not friendly and they were dangerous. With the first light of morning, I packed everything I could into my backpack. I checked every corner of the cabin for hidden people or traps. There was nothing. The forest was quiet again, but I didn't trust it. The summer had slipped past its peak by the time I found myself driving deeper into the woods than I had ever dared before. I had wanted a break from the noise of the city, a few days away from constant alerts on my phone, the bright streetlights, and the buzz of people always nearby. I was craving silence and space, so I rented an old cabin from a listing online. The photos showed a small wooden house nestled among tall pine trees, with a narrow dirt road leading up to it. Promised peace. What I didn't realize was how different the woods could feel when you were completely alone in them. The drive itself was longer than I expected. The paved road ended miles back, turning into a narrow path covered in gravel and dirt. My car rattled and bounced as I went over potholes and rocks. The trees grew closer together, blocking the sunlight, making the whole area feel cooler and darker. Birds were few, and the usual sounds of animals were quiet, almost absent. When I reached the cabin, it was exactly as the pictures showed, small and made of rough logs. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The windows were dusty but not broken. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside, the air was thick and smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed, and an old stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I had to light a fire to warm the room. The wood for the fireplace was stacked outside, and I carried enough in to keep the flames going through the evening. I unpacked my few bags slowly, the quiet stretching out around me. No cars passed, no voices, no lights except the fading glow from the fireplace. I found a small, yellowed notebook left on the table, but the pages were mostly blank except for some notes on the nearby trails and a few scribbled dates. Nothing that made much sense to me. Night came early, darker and deeper than I was used to. I sat close to the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the woods outside. There was no wind, but sometimes I thought I heard a faint crack or snap, like a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. It was probably just animals moving around. Deer maybe, or a raccoon. I reminded myself that the forest was full of life even when I couldn't see it. Sleep was hard. The cabin was quiet but not peaceful. Every small noise made me jump. The floorboards creaking under the old house settling, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window, the occasional hoot of an owl. I lay awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling. I felt the walls closing in, even though I was alone. The isolation started to press down on me, heavier than I expected. The next day, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling by walking the trails around the cabin. The dirt path stretched out into the trees, winding between the trunks and over roots. The ground was soft and damp, and I could smell the sharp, fresh scent of pine and earth after some recent rain. I followed the path for nearly 2 hours, climbing a small hill that gave me a better view of the forest. From up there, I saw the tops of the trees spread like a thick green blanket in every direction. But then something caught my eye. Down below, near the edge of the clearing, there was a spot where the ground looked disturbed. It wasn't natural, like something had been dug up and left there. The earth was loose, and a few broken sticks lay scattered around. I crouched closer and saw bits of torn cloth caught on a root. The fabric looked old and faded, as if it had been there a long time. A chill ran down my spine. The forest was full of wildlife, sure, but this wasn't normal. I wondered if someone had been here recently. Maybe someone else was staying nearby or had passed through. I made a mental note to check the place more carefully. Back at the cabin, I searched every corner. The floorboards, the porch, the bushes nearby. There were no signs of footprints, but that didn't mean much after the rain and wind. I found nothing else unusual, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, the sounds outside grew louder. Not just the usual animals, but something heavier, slower. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like something large was moving around the edge of the clearing. I kept the fire going, making it as bright as I could. I wanted to believe it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but my mind kept imagining worse things. I thought about leaving early the next morning, but I felt stuck. The woods had already pulled me in, and the idea of driving back through the empty roads seemed just as lonely and strange as staying. The second day passed much the same, except the noises outside didn't stop. Late in the afternoon, I heard something that made my heart pound. A low, slow thud, like heavy footsteps moving closer to the cabin. I froze, listening as the sound moved around the back and side of the house. The silence was thick and loud all at once. I kept the door locked and didn't move until the noise faded far away. Sleep that night was worse. The sounds pressed in, and I caught glimpses of shadows moving beyond the window when the firelight flickered. I stayed awake longer than before, too alert to rest, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I felt some relief. Morning was brighter, safer. I packed my small bag quickly and decided to walk back to the main road instead of driving the same rough path again. The air was cooler, fresher, and the woods looked softer in the daylight. On the way, I kept thinking about what I had found. The disturbed ground, the heavy footsteps, the feeling of eyes on me. When I reached the road, I stopped a moment and looked back toward the cabin. The trees stood still and silent, but I knew I wasn't the only one who had been there recently. Whatever it was still out there somewhere in the woods. I got into my car and drove away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line until it disappeared behind me. The city's noise and light didn't feel so bad after all. The woods were beautiful, but they also held secrets I didn't want to face again. I never went back to that cabin, but sometimes, when I'm quiet at night, I think about those heavy footsteps and the torn cloth in the dirt. The woods keep their stories, and some are better left alone. The cabin stood at the edge of the dense forest, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the wind. The air was crisp, filled with the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. I had rented the place for a week, wanting nothing more than to get away from the noise of the city, to be alone with nature, and to find some peace. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of thick logs that had darkened with age. The windows were small but let in enough light to see by during the day. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly musty, like the cabin had been closed up for a long time before I arrived. I had arrived in the late afternoon, carrying my bags through the narrow dirt path that led from the main road. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. I unlocked the cabin door, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the floorboards groaned underfoot. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and a cast iron stove in the corner. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no phone signal. It was exactly what I had hoped for. After unloading my things, I gathered some dry wood from a pile stacked outside and started a fire in the stove. The flames soon warmed the room and chased away the chill. I cooked some canned beans and ate quietly by the firelight. The silence outside grew heavier as night fell. No cars, no distant voices, only the wind and the creaking trees. It was peaceful but also strange, the kind of quiet that makes you listen too closely to every small sound. That first night, I lay awake on the creaky bed, listening to the forest. The wind picked up, causing the cabin walls to shudder. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped sharply. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just an animal. The moon cast long shadows through the window, and the room felt colder than before. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and eventually drifted off. The next few days passed slowly. I spent mornings hiking nearby trails, enjoying the untouched beauty of the forest. I saw deer tracks in the mud and heard the faint chatter of birds. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden beams. Back at the cabin, I read old paperbacks I had brought with me and wrote in a journal. The evenings were colder, and I built fires to keep warm. The stove's crackling was the only sound that filled the cabin, besides the occasional groan of the wood as it settled. On the third night, something changed. Just after dusk, while I was sitting by the fire, I noticed a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from outside. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the cabin wall. I froze, listening carefully. The tapping stopped after a minute. I walked around the cabin, looking for anything unusual. The forest was dark and still, the trees casting black shapes against the sky. There was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch hitting the cabin, maybe moved by the wind. But the sound had been too precise, too steady. I didn't sleep well that night, jumping at every creak and whistle of the wind. I kept the fire burning late, watching the flames dance. The next day, I found something strange near the back door. A small pile of rocks had been stacked carefully next to the porch steps. They weren't there before. I didn't know who could have left them or why. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there was no sign of footprints around. The ground was dry, no fresh marks. I felt a cold prickling at the back of my neck, but tried to shrug it off. As the days went on, the tapping returned, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the window panes. It always happened at night. I began to keep a knife nearby, feeling more nervous each evening. The forest, once a source of calm, now seemed like a trap. Every shadow looked like something watching me. I heard rustling just beyond the trees, but when I looked, nothing was there. One morning, I noticed the pile of rocks had grown. More stones were added, arranged in small circles and lines. I photographed them, thinking maybe some local kids were playing a prank. But the more I looked, the more they seemed deliberate, as if someone was trying to communicate or mark something. I kept the photos on my phone but didn't show anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid. One afternoon, I went further into the woods, hoping to find a trail or a sign of who might be near the cabin. The forest grew thicker, and the trees crowded together like they were closing in. I walked carefully, noticing the silence was deeper here. No birds, no insects. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves and pine needles. Suddenly, I saw fresh footprints in the mud, too large to be mine. They were human, heading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I followed the footprints slowly, trying not to make noise. They led to a small clearing, where the sun broke through the trees. In the center was an old, rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. I knelt down and brushed off the leaves. It was locked, but the lock was weak. I pried it open with a stick. Inside were some old papers and a small flashlight with dead batteries. The papers were yellowed and torn, written in faded ink. They looked like journal pages but were too damaged to read clearly. I took them back to the cabin, hoping to make sense of them in daylight. As I read through the pages, I realized they were from someone who had lived in the area long ago, someone who spoke of being watched and followed in the forest. The words were desperate and filled with fear. That night, the tapping was louder and more insistent. It wasn't just on the cabin anymore. It was on the windows and the door. I stayed by the fire, clutching my knife, watching the shadows. At one point, I thought I saw a figure moving just outside the window, but when I blinked, it was gone. On the fifth day, the tapping stopped suddenly. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. I felt like something was waiting, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things in the morning and cleaned the cabin as best I could. The forest felt colder, darker, as if it resented my leaving. As I walked down the path toward the main road, I looked back at the cabin once more. The pile of rocks had multiplied again, now surrounding the porch in a messy circle. I didn't want to think about what they meant or who had made them. I kept my pace quick and didn't look back again until I reached my car. Driving away, the trees blurred past me. The silence of the forest was left behind, replaced by the hum of the highway and the buzz of my radio. I felt relief flooding through me, though the memory of the cabin and those quiet, tapping nights stayed with me long after. I never found out exactly what was happening at that cabin. No one I asked knew of anyone living nearby, and the footprints vanished where I lost the trail. The papers I found remained a mystery, and the piles of rocks were never explained. But I knew one thing: that place, surrounded by the silent woods, had a presence. Not something supernatural, but something human, or close to it, watching from the shadows. Something patient and hidden. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I still hear the tapping. It's a reminder that some places hold secrets, and some secrets watch and wait long after you leave. The sky was a flat, dull gray when I arrived at the cabin, the kind of gray that swallows all color, making the world feel muted and still. I had driven for hours on a twisting, rough road that barely looked like a road anymore, covered in loose gravel and lined by tall, dense pines. The trees loomed over me, their dark green needles like shadows stretching down to the ground. The air smelled thick with damp earth and pine resin, the smell of untouched forest that settled in my chest and made me breathe slow and deep. The cabin was a small wooden structure sitting near the edge of a lake that stretched out like a long mirror, reflecting the dull sky and the skeletal branches of trees that dipped low into the water. It looked old, the kind of place you'd expect to see abandoned or forgotten, but it wasn't. The wood was weathered and gray, but sturdy, with a small porch that creaked under my boots as I stepped out. The windows were grimy, smudged from years of dust and rain, but I could see the faint glow of a wood stove inside. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as the wind stirred the dry leaves and whispered through the branches. I had come here alone, needing to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant rush of life that never slowed down. Work had been a pressure cooker. The city felt like it was closing in, and I just needed a break. Somewhere quiet where I could think. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just the forest, the lake, and the silence. The front door opened with a low groan, and inside, the air smelled of pine and old wood, mixed with a faint mustiness that told me the cabin hadn't been aired out in a while. The floorboards creaked under my feet, the walls bare except for a few faded photographs and a shelf with some old books and tools. The furniture was simple, rough wooden chairs, a small table with scratches and stains, and a bed with a thin mattress and a patchwork quilt. I set my bags down and went to the kitchen corner, where a small stove stood next to a sink. There was a pile of firewood stacked neatly near the door. I grabbed a few logs and stacked them in the stove, then pulled out matches from my pocket. The flame caught quickly, the fire crackling as it grew, sending a warm glow through the room and pushing back the cold shadows. I sat near the fire, pulling my knees up to my chest, watching the flames dance. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old cabin groan as if it were alive. The forest seemed to lean closer, the trees' long arms reaching toward the cabin, dark and silent. I could hear the distant call of a loon over the lake, its mournful sound echoing in the cool air. It was peaceful, but there was a strange weight to the silence, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I spent the day unpacking and exploring the small cabin. The wood on the floor was uneven and creaked with every step. The window glass was thick but wavy with age, distorting the view of the lake and the trees beyond. I found a small outhouse behind the cabin, its door hanging loose on one hinge. The ground was soft and damp from recent rain, the leaves slick and dark underfoot. Every step in the forest was muffled, swallowed by the thick carpet of moss and needles. As night fell, the sky turned a deep, inky blue. The stars scattered thinly across the heavens. The moon rose slowly, a pale orb casting long shadows between the trees. I made a simple meal on the stove, a can of beans and some bread, and ate quietly by the fire. The cabin felt smaller at night, the shadows stretching longer and the silence deeper. The wind rattled the windows again, and the trees outside seemed to sway closer, their branches tapping softly against the glass. I tried to read by the firelight, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the black shapes outside. Every little noise made me jump. The creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of something breaking. My mind began to fill in the gaps, imagining footsteps in the forest or eyes watching from the darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, just the forest settling down for the night. Sleep was uneasy. The mattress was thin and hard, the quilts rough against my skin. Every little sound woke me. An animal moving outside, the shifting of wood as the cabin adjusted to the cold, the occasional drip of water from the roof. I lay still, listening to the night sounds, the way the wind moved through the trees, the distant call of some bird or animal, and the constant, quiet ticking of my own heartbeat. The next day was colder. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, hanging low over the lake and the forest, turning everything pale and ghostly. I stepped outside, the dampness seeping into my boots, and the fog muffled all sound. The world felt smaller, closed in, like the trees had drawn a curtain around the cabin. I walked down to the lake shore, the water dark and still beneath the gray sky, and the fog swirling just above it. I spent hours wandering in the forest, following faint animal tracks in the mud, picking up fallen pine cones and smooth stones. The forest was alive with small sounds, birds flitting through the branches, the occasional scurry of a squirrel or chipmunk, the rustle of leaves underfoot. But there was no one else, no sign of people. The forest was thick and tangled, the trees growing close together, their branches intertwining high overhead so the sky was just a thin sliver. I went back to the cabin as the light faded, the fog still heavy around the edges. Inside, I stoked the fire and sat by the window, watching the mist swirl and curl around the trees. The silence felt heavier now, like the forest was watching, waiting. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself it was just my imagination. That night, the wind came in fierce bursts, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin like it might tear it apart. The fire flickered and dimmed, and I had to feed it constantly to keep the room warm. The cold crept under the door and through the cracks in the walls. I wrapped myself tightly in blankets, but sleep was impossible. Every gust made the cabin groan and creak, and every time the door slammed against the frame, I jumped. Around midnight, something changed. I was lying awake, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows, when I heard a sound outside the cabin. It was soft, a faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe an animal, but the steps were deliberate, slow, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. They circled, stopping here and there, as if whoever was out there was searching for something. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might wake the entire forest. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps moved closer, then farther away, then closer again. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, probably a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm was too steady, too human. The wind died down suddenly, and with the silence, the footsteps stopped too. For what felt like hours, I lay there, waiting, not daring to move or breathe too loudly. Then, just before dawn, I heard one last scrape near the window, a faint sound like nails scratching against wood. My breath caught, and I held still until the first light crept through the window, washing the cabin in pale gray. When I finally dared to get up, I looked outside. The ground was soft and wet from rain, but there were footprints around the cabin. Heavy, muddy prints, too large and uneven to be an animal. They circled the cabin twice, then disappeared into the forest. There was no sign of anyone, no voice or face, just the tracks and the cold silence. I stayed inside all day after that. The air felt heavy, the walls close. Every time I looked outside, I felt watched. The forest seemed darker, the trees closing ranks, hiding something just beyond sight. I burned more wood, kept the fire going strong, and stayed near the windows, watching the edges of the forest, waiting. The next morning, I decided it was time to leave. I packed quickly, moving with a nervous energy I couldn't shake. I checked every window and door, locking them tight before I started the engine of my car. The cold morning air was sharp and clear, and the sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I drove away down the rough road, the cabin grew smaller behind me, swallowed again by the trees and the fog. The forest was quiet now, still and waiting, but I knew something had been there, something real, something human, that had come close enough to touch the walls and hear the fire crackle inside. I never found out who or what had been circling that cabin in the night. Maybe it was someone else who used the forest for shelter, or someone lost, or someone who had been watching for a long time. Whatever it wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale. It was real enough to leave footprints in the mud and scrape marks on the wood. Driving back to the city, I felt relief mixed with a lingering unease. The silence of the forest was not the quiet peace I had hoped for. It was something else, watchful, waiting, and alive in a way I could not explain. But I was glad to be out of it, glad to be moving away from the dark trees and the cold cabin by the lake. That trip stayed. The sky was a deep, dark blue when I pulled off the narrow dirt road, the kind you barely notice until you're almost past it. The map said the cabin was a few miles in, hidden somewhere in the thick woods of northern Vermont. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone, no one around but the trees, the wind, and the quiet. I wanted a break from everything. The city noise, the constant buzz of people, and the endless screens. I needed to get away and just be still. The old truck rumbled as I drove down the dirt path, wheels kicking up dust and small rocks. The trees on both sides grew closer and taller, their thick branches stretching overhead, blotting out what little moonlight was left. The smell changed from the usual roadside trash and exhaust fumes to wet earth and pine needles. I rolled down the window for a minute, letting the cold, fresh air wash over me. After about 20 minutes, the road turned rougher, full of ruts and roots, and I had to slow down to keep from bottoming out. The GPS signal flickered like it was fighting to stay alive, which only made me more sure I was going deeper into the wild. The silence felt heavier now, like the world itself had paused. No birds, no bugs, no distant cars. Just the crunch of tires on gravel and my own breathing. Finally, I saw it. A small clearing with a wooden cabin that looked like it belonged to another time. The wood was weathered gray, moss growing along the edges of the roof, and the windows were dark and covered in dust. A thin chimney poked out above, and near the front door was a rusty mailbox with the number 47 carved roughly into it. I parked the truck and got out, stretching my legs. The air was chilly, and I could smell the faint scent of wood smoke, like someone had lit a fire here long ago but had since left. The cabin door creaked as I opened it. Inside was just as quiet as outside, with rough wooden floors and walls lined with old pine planks. A fireplace sat cold at one end of the main room, and there was a small kitchen area with a sink that didn't look like it had running water. The only light came from the window facing the woods, which framed a view of tall trees standing straight and silent. I set down my bag and took a moment just to breathe it in. I spent the next hour exploring. There was a small bedroom off to the side with a creaky bed and a dresser with a few drawers stuck halfway open. Dust covered everything, and I found a few old magazines and a box of matches on a shelf. I liked how basic it all was. No distractions, no noise, just the raw, natural world outside. I gathered some dry wood from a pile near the back and made a small fire in the fireplace. The crackle and pop of burning logs filled the room and made the cabin feel alive. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the cold creeping in through the thin walls. Outside, the wind started to pick up, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. I sat on the old couch, staring into the flames, feeling a strange mix of calm and alertness. As night deepened, I realized how dark it really was outside. No streetlights, no moon, just an endless black sea broken by the faint outlines of trees. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sound was the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. I thought about how alone I was, truly alone, and a small part of me felt vulnerable. I tried to focus on the fire and the quiet, but then I heard it, a soft, steady thump from outside. Not a random noise like a falling branch or an animal moving through the brush. This was something deliberate, like someone or something was coming closer. I froze, listening. The thump came again, slower now, but still there. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stood, creeping to the window. Outside, the darkness pressed close, but I saw nothing moving. The thumping stopped, and a cold sweat ran down my neck. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination, a sound carried by the wind or an animal knocking against a tree. But the noise had been too regular, too purposeful. For the rest of the night, I stayed near the fire, checking every few minutes if the door or windows showed any sign of movement. I didn't sleep much, my mind spinning through every possibility. Someone lost in the woods, maybe a hunter or something worse. I thought about how far I was from help, how my phone had no signal, and how the truck would be useless if I needed to leave in a hurry. Morning came slow and gray. The sky was cloudy, and the woods looked even more closed in without sunlight. I stepped outside with the flashlight to check the perimeter, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs someone had been near. The earth was soft from rain the night before, but completely undisturbed. It was like the noise had been a ghost. I spent the day trying to shake the unease. I collected firewood, explored a bit further into the forest, and even tried fishing in a small creek nearby. The water was cold and clear, and I caught a few small fish, which I cooked over the fire for dinner. The routine helped, giving my mind something to hold on to besides the strange sounds of the night before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt more at peace. The wind had died down, and the sky was clearing to a deep purple with stars beginning to peek out. I built another fire, feeling its warmth reach deep into my bones. Sitting on the rough wooden floor, I thought about how this trip was exactly what I needed. Being alone in the quiet, facing the unknown, and finding strength in myself. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard the thump again. Slow, steady, and deliberate. But this time, I didn't freeze. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, walking to the edge of the clearing. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I waited, heart pounding, but the sound didn't come again. I stayed outside for a while longer, listening to the night breathe around me. Eventually, I went back inside and locked the door, feeling safer behind the solid wood. I lay down on the creaky bed, firelight flickering through the window. Sleep came easier that night. When morning finally arrived, I packed up and headed back down the dirt road. The sun was bright, and the forest looked welcoming in the clear light. I realized the fear I'd felt was natural. Being alone in such a wild place puts you face to face with your own mind and its worries. But I also knew I had the strength to handle it. The cabin, the woods, the silence, they weren't trying to hurt me. They were just a reminder of how small and fragile we are out here, and how important it is to be ready, alert, and respectful of that. I drove away feeling lighter, knowing I could come back anytime. The forest wasn't a place of fear. It was a place of truth, and I was glad to have seen that for myself. The old cabin sat at the edge of the forest, just past where the dirt road gave way to narrow trails overgrown with wild grass. It wasn't much, just rough wooden walls with peeling paint, a sagging porch with creaky steps, and a rusty metal roof that rattled when the wind blew through the pine trees. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, a break from the noise of the city and the endless distractions of everyday life. I wanted silence, to be alone with my thoughts, and to feel what it was like to really disconnect from everything. The cabin promised all that and more. I drove up the dirt road in my old pickup, the tires crunching over rocks and dry leaves. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a fresh and sharp smell that filled my lungs and made me feel alive. I parked near the cabin and grabbed my backpack, which was stuffed with the basics: food, water, a small stove, matches, and a flashlight. My plan was simple: spend 3 days away from any signal, no phone, no internet, just me and the quiet. The front door was stiff when I pushed it open, the hinges whining like a tired old man waking from a nap. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a sink and a few cabinets, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. The furniture was rough and mismatched but sturdy. I took a deep breath, feeling the stillness settle around me like a thick blanket. The windows were covered in dust and spider webs, but the glass was intact. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, tall trees packed so tightly it was hard to see far beyond the edge. That first evening, I gathered some dry wood from the small pile by the porch. It took longer than I expected to get the fire going. The old stove didn't want to catch the kindling easily, but after a while, the room filled with warmth and the smell of burning pine. I sat on a creaky chair by the fire, peeling an apple and watching the flames flicker and dance. Outside, the sun dropped behind the hills, and the forest slowly darkened. The quiet was absolute. No cars, no planes, just the distant sound of birds settling in for the night. As night came, the cabin felt different. The shadows grew longer and deeper, and the wind whispered through the trees. It was peaceful but also strange, like the silence was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to read a book but found my eyes drifting to the windows. Outside, the moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely lighting the dense woods. My flashlight sat on the table, batteries fresh and ready, but I didn't want to break the stillness by turning it on. The quiet was heavy, almost like a presence pressing in on me. Later, when I finally lay down on the creaky bed in the small loft, the floorboards creaked beneath me with every movement. The mattress was thin and firm, and the blanket smelled faintly of must and wood smoke. I could hear the wind outside, rattling the window frames and bending the tall pines until they groaned. My breath came a little faster, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness of how alone I was. There was no one for miles, no way to call for help, just the dark forest surrounding this little cabin. I didn't sleep well that night. Every small noise made me jump. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the thump of something heavy falling outside. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my mind wouldn't settle. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the night sounds. The next morning, I woke early to the smell of damp wood and wet earth. Outside, the forest was still and cool. Mist curled around the trees, softening their dark shapes into fuzzy outlines. I made coffee on the little stove, the water bubbling and hissing as I waited. The cabin was silent except for the small noises of cooking. I ate a simple breakfast of bread and peanut butter, sitting at the table and watching the light change through the dusty windows. That day, I decided to explore a little. I took a small backpack with water and a map I'd printed from the internet before I came. The trail was rough, overgrown with brambles and pine needles, but I followed it deeper into the woods. The trees were tall and thick, their trunks covered in moss and lichen. The forest floor was soft and uneven, littered with fallen branches and dry leaves. I moved slowly, trying to listen to the sounds around me. The snap of twigs, the distant call of birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After an hour, I reached a small clearing. The sun broke through the canopy, shining down on a patch of wildflowers and a shallow stream. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones with a gentle rush. I sat on a fallen log and took off my boots, dipping my feet into the cool water. The forest felt alive here, full of small movements and quiet sounds. For a moment, I felt peaceful, connected to something bigger than myself. But as the afternoon wore on, the light started to change again. Clouds gathered overhead, and the wind picked up. I packed my things and headed back, moving faster now, trying not to get caught in the woods after dark. The trail seemed narrower on the way back, the trees closing in tighter, and the forest growing darker beneath the thick branches. When I reached the cabin, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. I quickly started a fire to warm up and dry my clothes, the rain beginning to fall in soft taps against the roof. I sat by the stove, watching the flames flicker and feeling the heat spread through the small room. Outside, the rain made a steady rhythm on the tin roof, soothing but also adding to the sense of isolation. That night, the storm was loud. The wind howled around the cabin, and rain hammered against the windows and walls. The wooden walls creaked and groaned, and I could hear water dripping through the roof in a few spots, making little puddles on the floor. I stayed close to the fire, wrapped in a blanket, feeling the cold creeping in despite the warmth. Around midnight, a noise outside caught my attention. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging slowly across the ground just beyond the porch. I held my breath and strained to listen. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and the wind had dropped, so the scraping was clearer. It sounded like something heavy, slow, and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly moved to the door, peering out into the dark. The beam of light caught the edge of the porch and the thick brush beyond, but I couldn't see anything moving. The scraping noise stopped. I waited, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard it again, a soft thud, like a heavy footstep on the wet ground. My mind raced through possibilities. A fallen branch? An animal? Someone or something else? The idea of a person out here at this hour was unsettling. The road was miles away, and the area was supposed to be empty. I shut the door quietly and locked it, sliding the bolt into place. My hands shook as I tried to calm down. The storm continued outside, the rain a steady drum on the roof, and the wind a low, mournful whistle through the trees. I sat back down by the fire, trying to focus on the warmth and the dancing flames. But the feeling of being watched settled over me, thick and heavy. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Every small noise made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the drip of water from the ceiling, the soft rustle of something moving in the bushes. I stayed awake until dawn, when the sky finally lightened to a dull gray. The next day, the forest was wet and slick with rain. The ground was muddy, and the trees dripped with moisture. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and checked the area around the porch. The ground was disturbed. Footprints pressed into the soft earth, large and heavy, dragging marks where something had been pulled or dragged along the ground. The prints led into the dense forest but disappeared after a short distance. I spent the day pacing the cabin, packing my things carefully. I realized I couldn't stay here any longer. The feeling of unease had settled deep into my bones, a warning I couldn't ignore. I packed every piece of food and water, put out the fire, and locked the cabin tight. When I drove away down the dirt road, the forest seemed to watch me go, silent and still once again. The footprints were real, the sounds were real, and the cabin wasn't the quiet refuge I had hoped for. It was a reminder that even in the wilderness, far from people and noise, you aren't always alone. And sometimes, the forest hides more than just trees and animals. The weekend was over, but the memory of those footsteps, the scraping sound in the night, and the weight of the dark woods stayed with me long after I left. I never went back to that cabin, but every time I hear the wind through the trees, I remember that quiet, heavy night and the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something lurking just beyond the light. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, winding through thick woods that seemed to swallow the fading light. I had been driving for hours on this narrow forest path, hoping to reach the cabin before dark. It was late October, the air had a sharp chill to it, and the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt track. I could hear the tires crunching on the gravel, the engine whining as I pushed the old truck uphill. The trees were tall pines mostly, some oaks with their leaves turning rusty red and gold, a sign that autumn was settling in properly. I wasn't used to driving in places like this. The city was my home. Noise, crowds, and light pollution were all normal to me. This was different, quiet, isolated. But that was what I wanted, a break from everything. The cabin was supposed to be my escape, a weekend away from work and constant emails, away from people and their endless demands. A friend had recommended the place, said it was peaceful, no neighbors for miles, just pure wilderness. He gave me the GPS coordinates, but the signal had been weak ever since I turned off the main highway. Now, I was basically following a blinking dot on a screen, hoping it would lead me to something real. When I finally saw the cabin, it was like a relief. It sat nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest. The wood was dark, weathered, and worn by time and weather. It wasn't fancy or new. No electricity poles or wires connected to it, just the cabin itself, sitting on a small rise with a fire pit ringed with stones nearby. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney. I pulled the truck onto a patch of grass and shut the engine off. The quiet hit me all at once. No cars, no planes, just the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. The cabin door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and old pine. The floorboards were uneven, the walls rough-hewn logs. A small wood stove sat in one corner, and a table with 2 chairs stood near a window looking out over the clearing. There was a simple bed against the far wall with a threadbare blanket, a small shelf with a few books, and a lantern hanging from a hook by the door. No running water, no electricity, Just the basics. Exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my bag slowly, laying out the food I had brought: some canned beans, bread, a small bag of coffee grounds, and a box of matches. I knew there was a well outside, and I would have to fetch water from there. After putting my things away, I stepped outside to gather some dry wood for the stove. The sun was almost gone now, the sky a deep orange fading into purple. I worked quickly, stacking logs near the stove and building a small fire in the pit outside to keep the mosquitoes away. As the fire crackled and popped, the first stars began to appear. The night air was cold, sharper than I expected. I pulled my jacket tighter and sat on a log near the fire, watching the flames dance. It was peaceful, but the darkness around me felt thick, like it could swallow sound and light alike. I told myself it was just the quiet of the forest, nothing more. Later, I went inside and lit the stove. The warmth slowly filled the room, softening the edges of the cold and damp. I made coffee on a small camping pot, the rich smell filling the cabin. Sitting at the table with the steaming mug in my hands, I looked out the window. The clearing was dim, the fire pit glowing faintly in the dark. Beyond, the trees were black shapes against the starry sky. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest kept me alert. The creak of branches swaying, the rustle of leaves, distant calls of unknown animals. Sometimes a sharp snap of a twig made me startle. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, but still, the feeling of being watched crept over me. I lay awake for hours, eyes wide, listening. In the early morning, just before dawn, I finally dozed off, only to be woken by a strange noise. It was low, rhythmic, like something dragging slowly across the forest floor. I strained my ears. The sound came closer, then stopped. Silence. My heart beat fast. I stayed very still, not daring to move. When the sun rose, I went outside with the first light, hoping the noise was just my imagination. The forest was quiet again, the cold morning mist hanging low between the trees. I followed the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of what had made the noise. At first, I saw nothing, just broken twigs and fallen leaves. Then I noticed tracks in the soft earth, large footprints, heavier than a deer's. They led from the forest to the edge of the clearing and stopped near the cabin. I stared at the prints, a pit opening in my stomach. They weren't animal tracks, at least not any animal I knew. Too big, too deep. I felt a cold sweat on my back. The idea that someone or something had been near my cabin during the night unsettled me deeply. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. People didn't just wander here. This place was supposed to be isolated. The day passed slowly. I decided to explore the surrounding woods, hoping to clear my head. I followed a narrow path that twisted deeper into the forest. The trees here were denser, the sunlight filtering through leaves in greenish beams. The forest floor was damp and covered in moss and fallen branches. Occasionally, I saw signs of animals: scratches on tree bark, a small pile of bones, feathers scattered on the ground. As I walked, the forest seemed to close around me. The sounds I heard earlier at the cabin returned. Rustling, snapping twigs, faint shuffling. I kept my eyes scanning the shadows between trees. The sense of being watched grew stronger. I found myself stopping often, looking around, heart pounding. The further I walked, the more uneasy I felt, like I was walking into something I wasn't meant to see. After an hour or more, I decided to turn back. The sky was clouding over, and the wind was picking up. I hurried back toward the clearing. When I got near the cabin, I saw the fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered by the wind. I went inside and locked the door. I knew the lock was old and probably weak, but it was something. I sat by the stove, warming my hands, trying to shake off the growing dread. That night was worse. The sounds around the cabin seemed louder, closer. I heard heavy breathing outside the window, faint footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. My eyes were fixed on the window, watching the dark shapes of trees shifting in the wind. I held a knife I'd brought for camping, feeling its cold handle in my hand. Sleep was impossible. Suddenly, A sharp bang rattled the cabin door. I jumped, heart in my throat. Then another, and another. Someone was pounding outside. I backed away, grabbing my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I tried the truck, same result. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it started. I sat in the corner, trying to steady my breath. I didn't know who or what was out there. Panic crept in, squeezing my chest tight. I thought about running to the truck, but the woods were pitch black and unfamiliar. I had no weapon except the knife and no real plan. Hours passed in silence. Eventually, the cold and fear wore me down. I dozed off, half curled on the floor near the stove. When morning came, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside the cabin, circling it completely. They were the same size as the ones I'd seen before, heavy and deep. But this time, they were closer. Too close. I packed quickly, not daring to look around much. I grabbed my bag and headed to the truck, not waiting to start a fire or eat breakfast. The drive back was slow and tense. Every shadow through the trees looked like something watching me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, eyes darting to the edges of the road. When I finally reached the main highway, I let out a long breath and didn't look back. Days later, I reported the footprints and strange noises to the local ranger station. They told me the area had some illegal hunters and squatters who sometimes camped in the woods, unregistered and often dangerous. People who didn't like strangers. They advised me never to go back alone. I didn't return. The cabin stayed behind, surrounded by dark woods and silence. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can see those deep footprints circling the cabin, hear the pounding on the door in the night, and feel the cold, watching eyes just beyond the trees. The wilderness is not always peaceful, and sometimes the scariest thing is not what you imagine, but what really lives in the shadows. The sun was just starting to set when I pulled up the gravel road leading to the cabin. The tires crunched over loose stones, and the truck rattled with each bump. It was late September, and the air carried a chill that hinted winter was on its way. I had chosen this place for one simple reason: isolation. No distractions, no one around for miles, just the small wooden cabin tucked away deep in the woods where I could finally clear my head. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. Built in the 70s, it looked worn but sturdy. Weathered cedar siding, darkened by years of rain and snow, wrapped around a simple rectangular shape. The roof was metal, rusted in places but still holding tight. There was a small porch with 2 wooden steps leading up to the front door. A single window on either side gave a peek inside, but the curtains were drawn tight. The smell of pine filled the air, mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimney. I grabbed my bags from the truck bed and walked up the porch steps. The boards creaked under my boots, and I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. Not from cold, but from the weight of silence surrounding me. There were no sounds of people, no cars passing, no dogs barking in the distance. Just the wind stirring the leaves and the occasional creak of trees swaying. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The floor was rough, unfinished wood, cold to the touch but clean. Against one wall was a simple wood stove, its black iron body stained with years of use. I set my bags down and lit a fire to chase the creeping chill away. The flames flickered and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture was sparse: an old wooden table, 2 chairs, a rickety bookshelf filled with dusty novels and nature guides, and a bed pushed into the corner with a threadbare quilt. The windows were small and had thick glass, fogged slightly from the temperature difference outside. I pulled back one curtain and looked out. The trees stood tall, dark silhouettes against the fading light, their branches reaching like fingers into the sky. I unpacked my things slowly, setting up my laptop on the table, though I wasn't sure I'd have internet out here. I came prepared for solitude, hoping to spend the week writing, thinking, and disconnecting from the noise of the world. As night settled, the cabin grew colder. The fire in the stove was the only source of warmth, and I found myself drawn to it, watching the glowing embers with a kind of uneasy fascination. The silence outside was absolute now. No animals, no wind, nothing. Felt unnatural, Usually, forests buzz with the life of crickets or the calls of owls. But here, it was as if everything had gone quiet. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar setting getting to me. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. It was normal to feel on edge. That night, I slept poorly. The thin walls didn't keep out the sounds of the night, but there weren't many. Instead, I woke to strange creaks and soft thuds that seemed to come from the woods just outside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sounds stopped as suddenly as they started. Morning light spilled through the curtains, warm and golden, chasing away the night's shadows. I brewed coffee over the stove and stepped outside, taking a slow walk around the cabin to stretch my legs. The forest was dense, filled with towering pines and maples, their leaves turning gold and red in the early fall. As I walked, I noticed footprints in the dirt around the cabin, deep impressions that didn't look like animal tracks. They were human, big, heavy. The soil was soft from a recent rain, making the prints stand out clearly. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of who might have left them. No discarded trash, no broken branches, nothing to indicate a recent visitor. I felt a flicker of unease again, but pushed it aside. Maybe a hunter or camper had passed through before me. The forest was vast, after all, and people came and went. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Mornings were spent hiking the trails nearby, afternoons writing by the fire, evenings preparing simple meals on the small propane stove in the kitchen. I'd bring wood in for the fire, stacking it carefully by the door, and sit for hours staring into the flames, letting the silence wash over me. But something kept nagging at me, small details I couldn't ignore. The footprints I'd seen weren't the only sign of someone else. One morning, I found the front porch door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it before bed. The lock was old, stiff, and took a firm twist to engage. Yet there it was, swinging open in the gentle breeze. I checked the inside thoroughly. Nothing was out of place, no sign of forced entry or theft. Still, the thought that someone had come close enough to open my door unsettled me. I started locking everything twice, making sure the windows were latched tight too. I kept a heavy cast iron skillet on the table within arm's reach, just in case. At night, the woods felt alive in a different way. I'd hear branches breaking far off, low rustling sounds, but nothing close enough to see. I convinced myself it was wildlife, the usual deer or maybe a raccoon or fox wandering near. Still, the feeling of being watched never quite left me. One evening, after dark, I was sitting near the window writing when a faint light appeared through the trees. At first, I thought it was a distant car or flashlight, but there was no road nearby. The light flickered erratically, moving slowly from one spot to another, disappearing behind trunks and bushes. I watched, heart quickening, as the glow came closer, though still too distant to make out any shapes. After a few minutes, it vanished altogether. The next morning, I found more footprints near the back of the cabin, bigger than before and fresh. They led off into the woods, deeper and deeper. I debated following them but stopped myself. What if whoever was out there didn't want to be found? I didn't tell anyone where I was staying. No phone signal, no way to call out unless I drove back down the road. The days grew colder and the nights longer. I kept the fire going constantly, and the small cabin felt more like a shelter from something outside rather than a peaceful retreat. One night, I woke suddenly to a sharp noise, the sound of something heavy scraping against the side of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, and close. My heart slammed in my chest. I grabbed the skillet and crept toward the window. Outside, just beyond the porch light, I saw a shadow crouched low, moving with careful steps. The figure was wearing dark clothes, blending into the blackness. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. I could see the faint outline of a face, tired and grimy, but impossible to tell any details. I dropped the skillet and stumbled back, slamming the window shut. The figure didn't move after that, just stood still for a moment, then slipped away into the darkness. I locked every door and window, sat by the fire shaking, trying to keep my mind clear. In the morning, I decided I wouldn't wait any longer. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the truck. Before I left, I walked around the cabin one last time, looking for any signs left behind. Near the back, I found a small pile of branches and leaves arranged neatly. Too neat to be natural. It looked like a marker or signal. I had no idea what it meant or who had put it there, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I drove away, the forest receded behind me, the cabin shrinking into a dark, surrounded by towering trees. The uneasy feeling didn't disappear immediately, but with every mile I put between myself and that place, it faded. Back in town, surrounded by people and noise, I thought about the week I spent alone. The silence that wasn't really silence, the footprints, the light in the woods, and the figure outside my window. I never found out who or what was out there. Maybe it was a hunter or drifter, someone else seeking solitude or hiding from something. Maybe it was just a man who didn't want to be seen. The cabin was never more than a quiet place in the woods to me, but I realized that sometimes being alone isn't about escaping the world. It's about facing what's already there, hidden in the shadows where you least expect it. From then on, I made sure to tell someone where I was going anytime I ventured into the woods. Solitude is a powerful thing, but it doesn't mean safety. And that's the only lesson the cabin taught me. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the very real, quiet presence of another person watching, waiting, and reminding you how small and vulnerable you really are. The moment I saw the cabin from the narrow dirt road, something about it felt off. It wasn't the usual peaceful cabin in the woods I had expected. The paint was chipped, the wood warped, and the windows were grimy with dirt and dust. Still, it was exactly what I needed, a place away from the city and away from people. I was exhausted and needed to clear my head after months of nonstop work. This cabin was tucked deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, and I had planned to spend a week alone, with nothing but a few supplies and the sounds of nature. What could go wrong? I pulled my old truck onto the small gravel driveway and stepped out. The air was crisp and cold, even though it was late spring. Pine trees surrounded the cabin on all sides, their trunks thick and dark. The forest was dense, and the light dimmed quickly once the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks. I grabbed my backpack and cooler from the truck bed and crossed the porch, which creaked under my weight. The door was locked, but a key hidden under a loose stone near the porch steps gave me access. I pushed the door open, and the smell of stale wood and damp earth hit me immediately. The cabin's interior was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet, with one main room, a tiny kitchen area, and a loft for sleeping. Dust covered the furniture like a thin blanket, and cobwebs hung in corners. A small wood stove sat cold in the middle of the room. I dropped my bags and opened the windows to let fresh air in. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. No cars, no voices, no signs of anyone else nearby. Just me and the woods. I unpacked my food, water, and gear carefully. I had brought canned goods, dry pasta, a small camping stove, and enough firewood to last a few days. I was prepared to be completely self-sufficient. After setting up the cabin and lighting a fire in the stove, I sat in an old, creaky chair by the window and looked out at the trees. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. Night came fast, much faster than I expected. Inside the cabin, the only light was from the flickering fire. Outside, the forest grew darker and thicker, shadows stretching like long fingers across the ground. I was calm but alert. The forest always has sounds at night, but I noticed something strange. The usual chorus of crickets, frogs, or owls was missing. It was unnervingly quiet. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the remote location. I double-checked the locks on the windows and door, then climbed the narrow stairs to the loft where my sleeping bag lay. I had barely closed my eyes when a sudden noise outside made me freeze. It was a soft, scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy over the gravel driveway. I waited, heart pounding, but the noise stopped as quickly as it had started. I didn't hear footsteps or voices, just the scraping. I told myself it was probably a branch rubbing against the cabin or an animal, but the feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest stretched endlessly, with thick underbrush and tall trees blocking most of the sunlight. The ground was soft and damp from recent rains. As I walked, I found old tire tracks near the driveway, not recent but from sometime this year. Someone had been here before me. I didn't expect that. I noticed faint footprints around the cabin too, boots, probably men's size 10 or 11. They were partially washed away by rain, but I could tell they had been made within the last few days. I didn't like the idea of strangers nearby. I took photos with my phone and marked the spots. That evening, I sat by the fire again, watching the shadows grow long and dark outside. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing near the tree line about 50 yards away. The figure was tall, wearing dark clothes, and stayed still as I blinked in disbelief. I dropped my fire poker in shock, and the figure disappeared behind the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside made me jump. I kept the fire going and my flashlight ready. The third day, I found a small trail leading deeper into the woods. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the trees closed in overhead. I decided to follow it, thinking maybe it led to a nearby river or clearing. As I walked, I noticed broken branches and signs of recent human activity. Pieces of torn cloth caught on thorns, crushed grass where something heavy had been dragged. The trail ended abruptly at an old campsite. A rusted, overturned tent frame lay on the ground, and empty cans and bottles were scattered around. It looked abandoned, but not long ago. I found a flattened area where a fire had been built and blackened stones in a circle. The scene gave me an uneasy feeling, like someone had left in a hurry. When I got back to the cabin, I checked all the locks and windows again. This time, I found something new. Scratches on the wooden door frame, deep and uneven. They looked like they had been made by a tool or knife, recent and deliberate. That night, I stayed awake all night, pacing the cabin, checking the windows every few minutes. Around 2 a.m., I heard the scraping sound again, louder and closer than before. It came from the back of the cabin, near the small shed where I kept firewood. I grabbed a heavy metal rod and slowly stepped outside, heart hammering in my chest. The night was pitch black, the only light from my flashlight beam cutting through the trees. The air was cold and smelled like wet earth and pine. I walked toward the shed, hearing the scraping stop just as I got close. There was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no movement, just silence. I locked the shed and went back inside, locking the door behind me and sliding a heavy chair against it. I realized then that I had been followed. Someone had been watching the cabin, waiting. The next morning, I packed up most of my things. I didn't want to leave immediately, but the fear was growing too strong to ignore. I decided to stay one more night and then head back to town. That day, I explored a little farther and found an old logging road that led downhill. I followed it to a small ranger station, abandoned but less worn down than the cabin. I found a notebook inside, covered in dust and spider webs. Flipping through, I found entries from a ranger who used to work the area years ago. The last entry mentioned suspicious activity, strange people hanging around, camping illegally, and reports of stolen equipment. I realized the cabin was not safe. Whoever had been around was likely part of that group. The woods weren't just empty wilderness. They were being used by people who didn't want to be found. That night, I stayed awake, listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard voices outside, low and muffled. I couldn't make out words, but there were at least 3 people. I hid in the loft, clutching my metal rod, waiting for dawn. As the first light broke, I saw 3 figures near the edge of the trees. They were dressed in dirty clothes, armed with knives and crowbars. They looked angry and desperate. I realized they were squatters or criminals hiding in the forest. I knew I couldn't stay. I waited until they moved away, then gathered my gear and left the cabin as quietly as possible. I drove all the way back to town without stopping. I called the local sheriff to report the cabin and the people I had seen. They told me they had been tracking that group for months but had trouble catching them because they knew the woods well. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace and quiet for me, but it turned into a trap I barely escaped. I learned that some places, no matter how beautiful or remote, can hide dangers you never expect. I haven't been back to the cabin, and I probably never will. But I keep thinking about those nights, the silence, the scratches, the shadows. They stay with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people, lost and dangerous, lurking just beyond the trees. The first thing I noticed when I got to the cabin was how quiet everything was. Not just quiet like a normal forest, but a silence so deep it felt almost heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. The trees around the cabin stood tall and thick, their branches forming a dense roof overhead, letting only small shafts of light slip through the leaves. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, but there was no wind, no movement beyond the tiny sounds of nature. It was a perfect kind of stillness that I had never experienced before. I pulled up to the gravel driveway in my old pickup truck, the crunch of the tires on the stones echoing through the woods. The cabin was a small wooden structure, made from rough logs that had weathered many seasons. It looked solid, simple, and uninviting in a way, as if it didn't want visitors. The windows were small, and most of them had curtains drawn. The front porch creaked slightly under my boots as I stepped out, and I took a moment to let the quiet sink in. I wasn't here for a vacation. I had come to the cabin alone, hoping to escape the noise of the city, the constant buzz of notifications, and the weight of everyday life. I needed a break, a place to clear my head, and this cabin, far from the nearest town, seemed like the perfect spot. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the cell phone reception was spotty at best, which was exactly why I picked this place. I wanted to disconnect. After unloading my gear, a small bag with some clothes, a few cans of food, a flashlight, and some basic camping supplies, I went inside. The cabin smelled like old wood, damp earth, and something faintly musty that I couldn't place. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved around, and the air inside felt cooler than outside. It was a single-room cabin with a tiny kitchenette in one corner, a small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall. I unpacked my things and lit a fire in the stove, watching the flames flicker and the warmth spread slowly through the room. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees. I felt a strange mix of calm and unease, but mostly calm. I thought I would get used to the quiet, the isolation. That first night, I slept fitfully. The sounds outside were unfamiliar. The creak of branches, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. But I was awake more than asleep. I felt like I was being watched, though I saw nothing. It was just a feeling, a tiny prickling at the back of my neck. When I woke in the morning, the sun was barely up, and the forest outside was shrouded in mist. I made some coffee on the stove and sat by the window, staring out at the gray shapes of the trees. The days passed slowly. I kept busy chopping wood, gathering water from a nearby stream, and exploring the area. The forest was thick and wild, with moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. I found animal tracks near the cabin, deer, raccoon, maybe a fox. I tried to keep track of where I was walking, marking trees with small cuts on the bark, so I wouldn't get lost. The isolation was heavy, but also peaceful in a way I hadn't known before. On the 3rd day, something strange happened. I was out by the stream filling my water container when I noticed footprints in the soft mud. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old, and they were too big to be deer or any animal I recognized. The prints led from the edge of the trees toward the cabin. I stared at them, heart pounding, but told myself it was probably someone hiking nearby. I felt relief, though part of me was on edge. I went back to the cabin quickly, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence outside seemed louder, filled with unexplainable noises. I kept hearing twigs snapping, just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. My flashlight sat on the table, charged, ready. I stayed awake, listening, eyes wide open, watching the windows for any sign of movement. The fourth day was colder. The sky was gray and thick with clouds, and a steady rain started in the afternoon. The sound of raindrops hitting the roof and the trees was soothing but made the cabin feel even more closed in, like I was trapped inside a box. I spent most of the day sitting by the stove, reading a book I had brought with me but barely paying attention. The dampness made my clothes cling to me, and the cabin felt smaller with every hour. Later that evening, I found more footprints outside, this time leading around the cabin's perimeter. They were human footprints, large, heavy, and definitely not mine. My stomach dropped. I was alone here, or so I thought. Whoever was out there had been watching me for days. I stayed up all night again, this time with the cabin's single shotgun I had brought just in case nearby. I was no expert, but the feeling of having a weapon close by helped calm my nerves. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move in the firelight. I imagined faces peering through the windows, heard faint whispers that might have just been the wind. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I packed up my things quickly, feeling a pressure in my chest that wouldn't go away. I wanted to leave before something bad happened. But when I stepped outside, I realized my truck was gone. The gravel driveway was empty. Panic hit me hard. I ran back inside and looked out all the windows. The forest was empty. No sign of the truck. I checked the keys in my pocket. They were still there. How had the truck disappeared? I hadn't heard anything during the night. I felt a cold sweat on my back. I started searching the forest, hoping to find the truck nearby. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soggy and slippery. After walking for what felt like hours, I found tire tracks in the mud leading away from the cabin. Someone had taken my truck. That's when I knew I was not safe here. I returned to the cabin just before dusk, exhausted and scared. The sun was setting fast, and the forest shadows grew longer. I barricaded the door as best I could with furniture and whatever heavy things I could find. The windows were small and few, but I covered them with blankets, hoping to block the view inside. That night was the worst. Every sound outside seemed amplified. Footsteps crunching leaves, branches breaking, distant voices I could almost hear but not quite understand. I stayed awake, gripping the shotgun tightly, waiting for the inevitable. Morning came slowly, and with it, an eerie calm. The forest outside was quiet again, but I knew it was only temporary. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I looked through the small kitchenette and found a map tucked inside a drawer. It showed a narrow dirt road a few miles from the cabin leading back to the main highway. I decided to try to reach it on foot and find help. I packed only the essentials, some food, water, the shotgun, and slipped out through the back door, moving quietly into the trees. The forest floor was thick with leaves and moss, making it hard to walk quickly. Every few steps, I stopped and listened, expecting to hear someone behind me, but only the sounds of the forest came. I kept going until I found the dirt road. It was overgrown in places, but passable. I walked for hours, following the map as best I could, feeling every nerve on edge. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I waved my arms, hoping the driver would see me. The truck slowed down and stopped. It was a local, an older man who lived nearby. He didn't ask many questions, just nodded when I told him I needed a ride to the highway. As we drove away from the forest, the cabin and the silent woods disappeared behind me, swallowed by the trees. The man dropped me off at the nearest gas station, where I finally got a signal and called the police. Later, I learned that people had been living illegally in the woods nearby. They had been using old logging roads and abandoned cabins like the one I stayed in. Some were harmless, but others were dangerous, stealing trucks and supplies, watching anyone who came too close. I never went back to the cabin or that forest. The experience left a mark on me. The deep, suffocating silence, the feeling of unseen eyes, and the raw fear of being truly alone but not alone at the same time. In the end, I'm grateful I left when I did. The forest holds many secrets, and sometimes, those secrets want to stay hidden. The cabin was just a small part of a bigger world I didn't understand. a world that can be cold, quiet, and terrifyingly real. It was the end of October when I decided to go to the cabin. I needed time away from the noise of the city, a quiet place to think, to breathe, to get away from everything for a while. I had rented a small, old cabin deep in the woods, a few hours' drive from town. The owner said it was simple, rustic, but comfortable enough, and the photos looked fine. I didn't expect anything special, just somewhere to be alone for a few days. The drive out was long but peaceful. I left just as the sun started falling, painting the sky orange and red. The highway led to smaller roads, winding through tall trees that started to lose their leaves. The air got cooler and the smell of pine and earth grew stronger. The last few miles were gravel roads, bumping and twisting. I kept my eyes on the narrow path, branches brushing the car on both sides, the fading light making shadows stretch long and thin. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked small but solid. It was made of rough wood logs, dark and weathered by time. The roof was metal, a little rusty, with a stone chimney rising from one side. There was a small porch with 2 wooden chairs that looked old but sturdy. The whole place was surrounded by tall trees, no neighbors in sight, only the silence of the forest around me. I parked the car near the porch and stepped out. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and moss. The ground was soft and damp from recent rain, and I could hear the faint rustling of dry leaves underfoot. The sky was turning dark, thick clouds rolling in, and I hurried inside. The cabin's door creaked when I opened it. Inside was a small room with a wood stove in the corner, a simple kitchen table, and a small couch. The floor was rough wood, cold and hard. There was a shelf with a few books and an old radio. A narrow staircase led up to a loft bedroom. The windows were small but clean, letting in little light. It smelled like damp wood and old smoke. I set my things down and started a fire in the stove. It took a while for the flames to catch, but once they did, the warmth spread quickly through the room. I unpacked some food, mostly canned goods and dry snacks, and heated water for coffee. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire and the occasional tapping of rain against the window. I settled in with a cup of coffee, feeling the heat from the stove on my face. Outside, the rain grew heavier, pounding the roof and the trees. The wind picked up, making the branches scratch against the walls like fingers. I watched the shadows dance on the walls, the firelight flickering in the dark room. I went upstairs to the loft. It was a small open space with a mattress on the floor, covered by a thin blanket. A single lamp hung from the ceiling, casting a soft yellow light. The wood beams were old and rough, and the floor creaked under my weight. I lay down and looked out the small window at the dark woods. The rain blurred the shapes of trees and branches. Sleep was hard to come by that night. The storm was loud, with thunder rumbling in the distance and wind shaking the cabin. Every small noise made me tense. The creaking of wood, the tap of rain, the distant call of a bird or an animal. I tried to tell myself it was all normal, part of being alone in the woods, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I kept my phone close, even though there was no signal, just for comfort. The next day, the storm passed. The air was fresh and cold, the ground wet but bright under a pale sun. I spent the morning exploring around the cabin, walking the small path that led into the forest. The trees were tall and close, their leaves a mix of yellow, orange, and brown. The forest floor was soft with moss and fallen leaves, and the smell of earth and pine was strong. I found a small creek nearby, the water clear and cold as it ran over smooth stones. Back at the cabin, I fixed a simple lunch and read one of the books from the shelf, a worn, old novel about the forest life. The quiet was peaceful, almost healing. I felt myself relax, letting go of the city stress bit by bit. The cabin was warm from the stove, the light soft in the afternoon. In the evening, I cooked a small meal on the stove, the smell of frying onions and toast filling the cabin. The sun set slowly, the sky turning from pale blue to deep purple and black. Outside, the forest grew dark and silent again. That night, something changed. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel near the porch. My heart jumped. I stayed still, listening, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft scrape, like someone dragging something heavy. I stayed in bed, the blankets pulled tight around me, staring at the dark window. The fire in the stove was almost out, the room cold and silent except for my own breathing. After a long time, the noises stopped. I waited until dawn, too afraid to move. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were deep footprints in the gravel, fresh and clear. They led away into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I didn't recognize the prints, too big to be an animal, and the pattern was odd, like heavy boots. There was no sign of what had been dragged. I wanted to leave right then, but my car was parked below the hill, out of sight. I spent the day watching the woods, staying close to the cabin, keeping the fire going. Every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing but trees and empty paths. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, louder and closer. I could hear breathing outside, heavy and slow. Something or someone was there, waiting. I thought about calling for help, but there was no phone signal. I was completely alone. I gathered some old firewood and stacked it near the door, ready to use if needed. I kept the stove burning bright, the flames pushing back the cold and dark. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, stopping here and there. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching, the sound of something heavy shifting on the porch. Then the banging started. Soft at first, like someone tapping on wood, then harder, louder. The door shook with each hit. I grabbed a heavy metal rod I found near the firewood, holding it tight. The banging went on for what felt like hours, pounding and scraping, trying to break through. Finally, the sound stopped. The forest went silent again. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten with dawn. In the morning, the porch was damaged. Scratches and dents marked the door and the wood around it. The footprints were deeper and more numerous. I found strange marks on the ground, deep gouges like claws, but too big for any animal I knew. I decided then I wouldn't stay another night. Packing quickly, I locked the cabin door as best as I could and carried my bags down to the car. The forest seemed calm in the daylight, but I didn't trust it anymore. On the drive back, the silence in the car was heavy. The trees blurred past the windows, the road straight and empty. Back in the city, the noise and lights felt overwhelming at first, but also safe. I looked up the nearest ranger station and reported what I had seen. They said it might be illegal hunters or squatters, people who sometimes sneak into remote cabins. They would send someone to check it out. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every quiet moment reminded me of the cabin, the footsteps in the dark, the banging on the door. But I was alive. I left before things got worse. The forest had been dangerous in a way I hadn't expected. Not because of ghosts or stories, but because people sometimes hide in the woods, waiting. That experience stayed with me. A sharp memory of cold nights, the smell of wood smoke, and the feeling that something real and threatening had been just outside my door. It taught me that sometimes the scariest things are not made up, but real. And when you're alone in the wild, you have to be ready for anything. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. But I do believe in the quiet power of nature and the dark things people hide behind its trees. That trip changed how I see the world. It showed me that fear isn't just stories. It's a warning. And sometimes, listening to that warning is the only way to stay safe. I never planned on staying in that cabin alone. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a short trip to clear my mind. I had been working too much, feeling burned out and restless, and the idea of a quiet place away from the city noise seemed perfect. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small wooden structure tucked deep in the woods, a couple of hours' drive from my apartment. No electricity, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and a chance to be alone with my thoughts. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday. The sun was already dipping low behind the tall pine trees that surrounded the dirt road leading to the cabin. I pulled my car onto the narrow clearing, the gravel crunching under the tires. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, with a shallow stream running nearby. It looked exactly like the pictures in the listing: weathered wood, a small porch, and 2 windows with cracked glass. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, a smell I hadn't experienced in years. The moment I stepped out, I noticed the silence. No birds, no wind, just the soft, bubbling sound of the stream and the faint creaks of the wooden cabin settling. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the rusty hinges groaning a little. Inside, the place was dark and smelled of old wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked underfoot. There was a simple kitchen area with a small stove, a wooden table, and a few shelves with old canned food. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bed was. I dropped my bag on the floor and pulled out my supplies. A few cans of food, bottled water, a flashlight, matches, and a thick blanket. I had no cell service here, which was part of the appeal, but also meant I was completely cut off from the world. I spent the first hour walking around the clearing, taking in the peaceful woods. The trees were thick and tall, casting long shadows in the fading light. The sky turned orange and pink as the sun slipped away, and the air cooled quickly. I gathered some dry wood near the porch and built a small fire pit, arranging stones in a circle to keep it safe. Back inside, I lit a candle and prepared a simple dinner of beans and rice heated on the stove. The cabin felt cozy despite the roughness. I sat by the small window watching the dark woods outside. I had brought a notebook with me to write, hoping to capture some thoughts and maybe sketch the trees and rocks. But after a while, the quiet started to feel heavy, the kind of quiet that makes every little noise seem louder. At some point, I heard a snap outside, like a branch breaking. I froze, listening hard. Nothing else, just the crack of wood and then silence again. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably an animal. The woods here were full of deer and raccoons, maybe even a fox or 2. The night stretched on. The fire outside burned low and the candle flickered on the windowsill. I climbed the stairs to the loft and lay on the thin mattress. The ceiling was low, the roof made of rough wooden beams. Outside, the wind had started to pick up, rustling the leaves and making the branches scrape softly against the cabin walls. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, a faint noise, like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from the floor. The beam cut through the darkness below, lighting up the small kitchen and the door. I waited, heart pounding. Nothing moved outside. I told myself I was imagining things. The woods here were alive, always making sounds. Maybe an animal was just walking nearby. Still, I didn't like the feeling of being watched, even though I knew no one else was supposed to be out here. Morning came slowly. The sunlight filtered through the trees, making dappled patterns on the floor. I boiled water for coffee and ate some granola bars. I decided to explore the area to keep my mind busy. I put on my boots and stepped outside. The woods were beautiful in the daylight. The stream sparkled, and birds chirped from the branches. I wandered down a narrow path, noticing old tree stumps and fallen logs covered in moss. The forest was thick but inviting. I found a small clearing with a circle of stones, like someone had built a fire pit here before. I wondered if other people came this far in. As I walked back, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft mud by the stream. They were fresh and definitely not mine. They were big, like boots, and they headed deeper into the woods. My heart skipped. Who else could be out here? I scanned the trees but saw no movement. I decided to get back to the cabin and lock the door. I spent the rest of the day trying to relax, reading an old paperback I had brought along. The quiet helped, but I kept checking the windows, feeling nervous about the footprints. The sun set again, and with the darkness came the silence, deeper and more oppressive than before. That night, the noises started again. Not just footsteps, but scratching sounds against the cabin walls, soft thuds on the porch roof, and sometimes the crunch of leaves nearby. I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight, staring at the door. Every creak made me jump. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle. I froze, heart hammering. Whoever was outside tried the knob, but it was locked tight. I leaned close to the door and could hear heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. Then footsteps retreating slowly into the woods. I didn't sleep that night, I sat in the corner near the window with the flashlight on, waiting for dawn. When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved. The woods looked calm again, and the footprints near the stream were still there, but now they seemed farther away. I thought about leaving. I wanted to pack up and drive back to the city, but I also didn't want to let whoever was out here win by scaring me away. I had come for peace, and I would stay and get through this. I spent the next day preparing. I gathered more firewood and blocked the windows with old boards I found in the shed. I dug a small trench around the cabin to slow anyone who might try to get close quietly. I knew it wasn't much, but it made me feel safer. That night was the worst. The sounds came all at once. Pounding on the door, banging on the walls, loud stomps on the porch. I stayed silent, holding my breath. I could hear heavy footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. The flashlight battery was dying, but I kept it on, scanning the darkness. Hours passed like that until the pounding stopped. The woods went silent again. I didn't move until morning. When I finally opened the door, the ground around the cabin was disturbed, prints everywhere. There were also marks on the door frame where something had scratched hard. I packed my things quickly that morning. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I walked to my car with my heart pounding, glancing back at the cabin. The woods were quiet, but I didn't feel safe. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I never found out who had been out there or why they chose that cabin. All I knew was that sometimes being alone in the woods isn't peaceful. It's terrifying.